Hello, friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The CB radio went silent at exactly mile marker 127 on Interstate 40 through New Mexico, and Jake Morrison felt the absence of sound like a physical blow to his chest. For 15 years, he'd been hauling freight across America's highways, and in all that time, he'd never experienced anything quite like the oppressive quiet that suddenly filled his cab. The silence wasn't natural. It was the kind of electronic void that made experienced truckers reach for their radio knobs and start checking connections, wondering if their equipment had failed at the worst possible moment. Jake had been listening to the same conversation for the past 23 minutes, ever since he'd picked up the chatter just east of Albuquerque. Two drivers discussing fuel prices at the Flying J in Tucumcari, a third complaining about a dispatcher who couldn't find his own ass with both hands and a GPS unit, and a fourth offering advice about a construction zone near the Texas border. Normal trucker talk, the kind of highway communion that filled the lonely hours between major cities and made the isolation of long-haul freight bearable for men and women who spent their lives in moving steel boxes. The conversation had been typical in every way, casual, profane, informative, and comforting in its familiarity. Drivers sharing information about fuel stops, weather conditions, enforcement activity, and the thousand small details that made the difference between a good run and a disaster. Jake had been half listening while monitoring his truck's performance, checking his mirrors and watching the New Mexico landscape roll past his windshield like frames from an old Western movie. Then, between one transmission and the next, the voices simply vanished. Jake Morrison wasn't a man who spooked easily. At 43 years old, he'd accumulated enough highway experience to fill a library of cautionary tales. He'd driven through ice storms that turned interstates into skating rinks, tornadoes that threw debris across highways like some angry god playing pickup sticks, and fog so thick he couldn't see his own hood ornament. He'd dealt with mechanical failures that should have killed him, drunk drivers who played chicken with 18-wheelers, and lot lizards who looked like they'd crawled out of Stephen King's darkest imagination. But something about the silence at mile marker 127 felt fundamentally different from the normal hazards of trucking life. This wasn't weather, mechanical failure, or human stupidity. This was something deliberate and predatory that set off alarm bells in the primitive part of his brain that evolution had designed to keep prey animals alive in a world full of hunters. Jake reached over and tapped his Cobra 29 LX CB radio, a piece of equipment that had been his faithful companion since 2008, when he'd first climbed behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle. The radio had been a gift from his mentor, an old-school driver named Buck Williams, who'd taught Jake everything about highway survival that couldn't be learned from manuals or training courses. "This here radio," Buck had said, pressing the microphone into Jake's hands, "is gonna be worth more to you than all the GPS units and satellite phones in the world. Long as truckers are talking, you know everything's normal. When they stop talking, that's when you start worrying." The Cobra's channel selector was still set to 19, the unofficial trucker frequency that carried traffic from coast to coast. The display showed strong signal strength with 5 bars indicating optimal reception conditions, but the speakers produced only the kind of electronic silence that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up like he'd walked into a cemetery at midnight. He tried adjusting the squelch, checking the antenna connection, and cycling through nearby channels, but every frequency delivered the same unnatural quiet. Jake keyed his microphone, breaking his own cardinal rule about maintaining radio discipline on busy highways. "Breaker 19, this is Road Dog eastbound on I-40 at mile marker 127. Anyone got their ears on out there?" His transmission echoed back to him through the radio's speaker, confirming that his equipment was functioning properly. But no response came from the ether, no acknowledgement from the dozens of drivers who should have been within radio range on this heavily traveled freight corridor. It was as if every truck on Interstate 40 had suddenly vanished, leaving Jake alone on a highway that stretched through empty desert toward a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. Jake Morrison wasn't the kind of driver who jumped to supernatural conclusions or believed in conspiracy theories that blamed missing truckers on alien abductions or government cover-ups. He approached problems with the methodical logic of a man who'd learned to diagnose mechanical failures by sound, smell, and vibration. If something was wrong with his radio reception, there had to be a rational explanation. Atmospheric interference, equipment failure, or temporary dead zones created by geographic features that blocked radio signals. But as he continued eastward past mile marker 128, then 129, then 130, the silence persisted with the consistency of something artificial rather than natural. Jake had driven this stretch of I-40 hundreds of times over the past decade, and he knew the radio traffic patterns as well as he knew the locations of every truck stop and way station between Albuquerque and Amarillo. There should have been chatter from drivers discussing routes, weather, road conditions, and the endless stream of information that kept America's truckers connected across thousands of miles of highway. Instead, he heard nothing but the subtle electronic hiss that suggested his radio was receiving signals. But those signals contained no information, no voices, no data, no evidence of human presence anywhere in the electromagnetic spectrum that connected truckers to each other and to the civilization they served by moving freight from point A to point B. The New Mexico landscape rolling past Jake's windshield looked exactly as it always had. Red rock formations jutting up from scrubland that stretched to the horizon. Mountains in the distance that looked like sleeping giants under a sky so big it seemed to swallow his truck whole. Beautiful country in its own harsh way, but empty in a manner that reminded a man how small and vulnerable he was out there on the highway, with nothing but steel and glass between himself and the elements that could kill him if his equipment failed or his judgment faltered. Jake had been running this route for over a decade, hauling everything from machine parts to electronics between California and Texas, learning every truck stop, every way station, every place where state troopers like to set up speed traps, and every mile of highway where weather, terrain, or traffic patterns created special challenges for commercial drivers. He knew where to buy the best coffee, which truck stops had clean showers, and which dispatchers would lie to your face about delivery schedules just to make their own lives easier. But in all his years on I-40, he'd never experienced anything like the radio silence that surrounded mile marker 127 like some kind of electronic dead zone that swallowed voices and replaced them with the kind of quiet that made experienced drivers check their mirrors more frequently and grip their steering wheels a little tighter. Jake's 2019 Peterbilt 579 hummed along at exactly 67 miles per hour. 3 mph under the posted speed limit in deference to fuel economy and the electronic logging device that recorded his every movement for DOT compliance. The truck was his pride and joy, a rolling testimony to 15 years of careful saving and financial discipline that had allowed him to transition from company driver to owner-operator. Every payment, every maintenance expense, every insurance premium represented a step toward the independence that made trucking more than just a job. It was a way of life that offered freedom, responsibility, and the satisfaction of building something that belonged to nobody but himself. The Peterbilt's 455 horsepower Packard MX-13 engine pulled his 53-foot trailer with the effortless power that made highway driving a pleasure rather than a chore. His load was secured and balanced according to DOT regulations. His fuel tanks were 3/4 full, and his electronic systems showed all parameters within normal ranges. According to every measurable criteria, this was shaping up to be another routine run across familiar territory with no complications beyond the normal challenges of highway freight transportation. but the silence on his CB radio suggested that something was wrong in ways that couldn't be quantified by instruments or explained by reference to standard trucking procedures. Jake had learned to trust his instincts during 15 years of highway driving, and right now those instincts were screaming that mile marker 127 marked the beginning of territory where normal rules might not apply and standard precautions might not be sufficient to ensure safe passage. The silence stretched on for another 5 miles, past mile marker 132, past the exit for a truck stop where Jake usually bought fuel, past landmarks that should have triggered radio chatter from other drivers sharing information about road conditions, fuel prices, and the 100 details that made long-haul trucking a community activity rather than a solitary ordeal. But no voices broke the electronic quiet that surrounded his truck, like some kind of technological fog bank that blocked communication while leaving visibility unchanged. At mile marker 134, Jake's CB radio suddenly crackled back to life with a transmission that made his blood run cold and his hands tighten on the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks in the leather grip. Breaker 19, this is Nightcrawler calling any drivers eastbound on I-40. You need to stay away from mile marker 127, boys. We got ourselves a situation developing out here that ain't natural, and it sure as hell ain't safe. The voice was deep and gravelly, seasoned by decades of highway miles and countless conversations across America's CB networks. But underneath the familiar cadence of trucker speech, Jake detected something else. A tremor that suggested fear, maybe even terror, from a man who'd probably seen everything the highway could throw at a professional driver. Jake had heard that tone before, usually from drivers who'd just walked away from accidents that should have killed them or witnessed tragedies that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Jake keyed his microphone immediately, hungry for human contact after the unnatural silence that had surrounded him for the past 20 minutes. Nightcrawler, this is Road Dog eastbound. Just passed through the 127 area about 15 minutes ago. What kind of situation are we talking about here? The response came after a long pause filled with the kind of atmospheric static that made Jake wonder if the other driver was losing signal strength or just trying to figure out how to explain something that challenged conventional understanding of highway safety and criminal behavior. Road Dog, you need to understand something. And I need you to listen careful-like because this information might save your life or the life of some other driver who thinks he knows what he's dealing with out here. Nightcrawler's voice carried the authority of experience and the urgency of someone who'd seen enough tragedy to last several lifetimes. There's been trucks disappearing on this stretch of I-40 for the past 3 months. Good drivers, experienced professionals who know what they're doing and how to handle trouble when it comes calling. They check in normal at mile marker 127, then nobody ever hears from them again. Jake felt his stomach drop like he'd hit an unexpected pothole at highway speed. Missing truckers weren't uncommon. Drivers who suffered medical emergencies, mechanical failures in remote areas, or personal problems that made them abandon their rigs and disappear into the general population. But systematic disappearances on a specific stretch of highway suggested something much more sinister than random misfortune or individual crisis. What does the highway patrol say about these disappearances? Jake asked, hoping for some indication that law enforcement was aware of the problem and taking appropriate action to protect drivers using I-40. That's where it gets really ugly, Road Dog. State police find the rigs abandoned at mile marker 128. Engines still running, doors hanging open like the drivers just vanished into thin air. No signs of struggle, no evidence of mechanical problems, no indication what happened to make experienced truckers abandon their equipment in the middle of nowhere. The image of abandoned trucks with their engines running and doors open sent a chill through Jake that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in his cab. Professional drivers didn't abandon their equipment under normal circumstances. A truck represented too much investment, too much livelihood, too much personal identity to be left behind unless the alternative was immediate death or something worse than death. How many trucks are we talking about, Nightcrawler? 7 that I know of for certain. Could be more that haven't been reported yet, or got classified as something else by authorities who don't want to admit they got a serious problem on their hands. Nightcrawler's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd dealt with law enforcement agencies more concerned with public relations than public safety. Company drivers, owner-operators, guys running solo in teams. Only thing they got in common is they all disappeared between mile markers 127 and 128 on eastbound I-40, and every one of them was hauling high-value freight when they vanished. Jake's mind immediately went to his current load, computer servers and networking equipment bound for data centers in Dallas. Cargo worth north of $2 million according to the bill of lading locked in his glove compartment. Electronics, pharmaceuticals, precision machinery, and other high-value freight represented the most lucrative targets for cargo thieves who'd moved beyond simple hijacking into more sophisticated operations that required inside information and professional execution. "You think we're dealing with organized cargo theft?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect that whatever was hunting truckers on I-40 represented something much more dangerous than ordinary criminals looking for easy scores. "I think we're dealing with something professional, organized, and deadly as a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag," Nightcrawler replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd connected dots that law enforcement either couldn't see or didn't want to acknowledge. "These ain't random hijackings, Road Dogg. Somebody's got inside information about what trucks are carrying what loads, when they're traveling, and what routes they're taking. They're picking their targets careful-like, and they got methods for making experienced drivers disappear without leaving enough evidence for a proper investigation." Jake checked his mirrors and scanned the horizon for other vehicles, suddenly aware that I-40 through this part of New Mexico seemed unusually empty for a major freight corridor during prime traveling hours. He should have been seeing other trucks, cars, RVs, and the normal mix of traffic that used the interstate system to cross the American Southwest. Instead, the highway stretched empty in both directions like some kind of automotive wasteland where vehicles went to disappear. "Any description of vehicles or people involved in these disappearances?" Jake asked, hoping for actionable intelligence that might help him recognize threats before they became lethal. "That's the scary part, Road Dogg. Near as anyone can tell, there ain't been no suspicious vehicles reported by witnesses, no unusual activity observed by other drivers, no nothing that would explain how 7 trucks and 7 drivers just vanished like smoke in a windstorm." Nightcrawler paused, and Jake could hear what sounded like wind rushing through the transmission, as if the other driver was speaking from an open cab or moving vehicle. "These drivers just disappear like they got beamed up by aliens or sucked into some kind of highway Bermuda Triangle." Jake didn't believe in aliens or supernatural phenomena, but he believed absolutely in human ingenuity when it came to separating people from valuable property. Someone had figured out a system for making truckers disappear without leaving witnesses or evidence, which meant they possessed planning capabilities, sophisticated equipment, and experience gained through previous operations. The kind of criminal enterprise that took time to develop, resources to finance, and connections to support. "What happens to the cargo?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Gone. Every load. Every time. Trailers found empty. Doors sealed back up professional-like so you couldn't tell they'd been opened unless you knew what to look for." Nightcrawler's voice carried a note of grudging respect for the criminal's technical competence. "Whoever's doing this, they got the equipment and know-how to offload freight fast and clean. We're talking about crews with forklifts, maybe refrigerated storage for pharmaceutical loads, and transportation to move stolen goods out of the area before anyone knows a crime's been committed." Jake's CB radio went silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Not the oppressive electronic void that had surrounded mile marker 127, but the natural pause that occurred when drivers needed time to process information or scan their surroundings for potential threats. Jake used the silence to assess his situation and consider his options for avoiding whatever fate had befallen the 7 drivers who'd preceded him through this stretch of highway. His current load represented exactly the kind of high-value cargo that Nightcrawler had described as characteristic of the disappearance victims: computer servers, networking equipment, and telecommunications hardware worth over $2 million, the kind of freight that would make cargo thieves salivate if they knew what was riding in the trailer behind his cab. Jake had been running high-value loads for years without significant problems, relying on good route planning, secure parking, and his own experience to avoid the predators who viewed truckers as mobile ATMs filled with merchandise instead of money. But if someone was systematically targeting expensive cargo on I-40, using inside information about load contents and delivery schedules, Jake was essentially driving a rolling bank vault with a target painted on his trailer in letters big enough to be seen from orbit. The criminals weren't just stealing random trucks. They were conducting surgical strikes against specific loads, using intelligence that could only come from sources inside the freight industry. Jake's radio crackled back to life as Nightcrawler resumed his transmission, but the signal seemed weaker and more distant than before, as if the other driver was moving away or encountering interference that degraded communication quality. "Road Dog, you still out there listening to this old fool ramble about things that probably sound like trucker fairy tales?" "I'm here, Nightcrawler, and nothing you've said sounds like fairy tales to me. Sounds like information that might keep me from becoming victim number 8 in whatever operation is hunting trucks on I-40. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, driver. Shows you got sense enough to take threats seriously instead of assuming that bad things only happen to other people." Nightcrawler's voice carried approval mixed with concern. "Question is, what are you going to do with this information now that you got it?" Jake had been asking himself the same question since Nightcrawler's first transmission had shattered the unnatural silence surrounding mile marker 127. His options were limited by geography, load requirements, and the simple reality that he was already committed to a route that took him through the hunting ground where 7 drivers had vanished without a trace. He could turn around and backtrack to Albuquerque, looking for an alternate route that avoided I-40 entirely. But adding hundreds of miles to his trip would put him in violation of delivery schedules that were already tight, potentially costing him the contract that represented a significant portion of his quarterly income. More importantly, running scared from unsubstantiated threats went against every instinct Jake had developed during 15 years of highway driving. He could continue eastward while maintaining maximum vigilance and communication with other drivers, hoping that awareness and preparation would be sufficient to avoid whatever trap had claimed the previous victims. But if the criminals possessed the sophistication and resources that Nightcrawler had described, simple vigilance might not be enough to counter their methods. Or he could try to contact law enforcement and report the threat, hoping that official intervention could neutralize the danger before it claimed additional victims. But Jake's experience with highway patrol suggested that without concrete evidence or active crime in progress, authorities were unlikely to provide meaningful protection for individual drivers crossing jurisdictional boundaries on the interstate system. "Nightcrawler, I'm carrying high-value electronics to Dallas, which means I'm probably exactly the kind of target these people are looking for. What would you do if you were in my position?" The response came immediately, without hesitation or qualification. "I'd get the hell off I-40 and find another route, even if it cost me time and money. No load is worth your life, Road Dog, and no delivery schedule is worth joining the list of drivers who vanished somewhere between mile markers 127 and 128. But even as Nightcrawler spoke, Jake knew that retreat wasn't really an option. His reputation as a reliable carrier depended on meeting delivery commitments regardless of obstacles, and his financial situation didn't allow for the kind of flexibility that would let him absorb the costs of rerouting around potential threats. More fundamentally, abandoning his route based on unconfirmed reports went against the professional pride that made trucking more than just a job for drivers who took their responsibilities seriously. "I appreciate the advice, Nightcrawler, but I'm going to have to stay on I-40 and take my chances. Can't build a business by running from every threat that might exist out there on the highway." "I figured you'd say that, Road Dog. Most good drivers would make the same choice, which is probably why 7 of them are missing and presumed dead." Nightcrawler's voice carried resignation mixed with respect. If you're determined to keep rolling eastward, at least promise me you'll stay alert and keep your radio on. First sign of trouble, you get on Channel 9 and start hollering for help." Jake promised to maintain communication and report any unusual activity, but he wondered how much good radio contact would do if the criminals possessed electronic jamming equipment or other technical capabilities that could isolate their victims from outside assistance. 7 experienced drivers had vanished without sending distress calls or leaving evidence of their final moments, which suggested that whatever was hunting trucks on I-40 struck with sufficient speed and precision to prevent effective resistance. As Jake continued eastward past mile marker 135, he began to notice details about his surroundings that hadn't registered during the thousands of previous trips he'd made through this area. The landscape seemed more desolate than usual, with fewer visible signs of human presence and an oppressive quality that made the familiar terrain feel alien and threatening. The sky, which had been clear and bright when he'd departed Albuquerque, now showed high clouds that filtered the sunlight and cast shifting shadows across the desert floor. More significantly, Jake realized that he hadn't seen another truck for almost 30 minutes. An unusual situation on a major freight corridor that normally carried steady commercial traffic throughout the day and night. Cars and smaller vehicles were also scarce, creating an isolation that felt artificial rather than coincidental. Either traffic patterns had shifted dramatically without his awareness, or something was actively discouraging vehicles from using this stretch of highway. Jake's CB scanner, which monitored law enforcement frequencies in addition to commercial channels, remained silent, except for occasional routine transmissions from dispatchers dealing with administrative matters hundreds of miles away. No emergency traffic, no pursuit reports, no indication that authorities were aware of criminal activity in the area. The absence of police radio chatter could mean that law enforcement was handling the situation through secure channels, or it could mean that the criminals were operating below the radar of official awareness. At mile marker 138, Jake's radio crackled with a transmission that immediately set off every alarm bell in his experienced driver's brain. "Eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 138. This is Highway Patrol Unit 47. You need to reduce speed and prepare for an inspection stop at mile marker 140. Jake looked in his mirrors but saw no sign of law enforcement vehicles anywhere in his vicinity. His speedometer showed 67 mph in a 75 mph zone, well within legal limits and hardly worth official attention unless authorities were conducting systematic inspection sweeps. His paperwork was current. His electronic logging device showed compliance with hours of service regulations, and his equipment was properly maintained according to DOT standards. There was no legitimate reason for Highway Patrol to single him out for inspection unless they possessed specific intelligence about his cargo or had received reports of violations. More troubling was the fact that Jake couldn't see any law enforcement vehicles in his mirrors, on the highway ahead, or anywhere in the surrounding landscape. Highway Patrol units conducting roadside inspections typically positioned themselves visibly to ensure driver compliance and officer safety. The absence of visible patrol cars suggested either that the officer was using unmarked vehicles or that the transmission was fraudulent. Jake keyed his microphone, trying to sound cooperative while seeking information that would confirm the legitimacy of the inspection request. "Highway Patrol Unit 47. This is the eastbound Peterbilt. I don't show any law enforcement vehicles in my area. Can you provide your location and vehicle description for my logbook records?" The response came immediately, delivered in a voice that sounded official and professional but somehow wrong in ways that Jake couldn't immediately identify. The speech patterns were correct, the terminology appropriate, but something about the transmission felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "Peterbilt driver, we are positioned ahead of your location using unmarked units for enhanced enforcement activities. Reduce speed to 45 mph and activate your hazard lights. This is a routine cargo inspection that should take approximately 20 minutes. Several aspects of the transmission struck Jake as suspicious. Highway patrol officers typically identified themselves by name and badge number when conducting official business. They provided specific locations and detailed instructions about where drivers should stop for inspections. Most importantly, they used marked patrol cars for roadside inspections to ensure officer visibility and driver compliance. The reference to enhanced enforcement activities using unmarked units sounded like official jargon, but Jake had never encountered highway patrol operations that relied on invisible officers and unmarked vehicles for routine cargo inspections. Moreover, the instruction to reduce speed to 45 mph would create a significant hazard on an interstate highway where traffic normally moved at 75 out and 80 mph. Jake made a decision that would either save his life or mark him as an uncooperative driver who created problems for legitimate law enforcement officers. Unit 47, I'm going to need your badge number, supervisor contact information, and dispatch confirmation before I comply with any inspection request. Department policy requires verification of authority for roadside stops. The silence that followed Jake's transmission lasted almost 30 seconds, too long for a legitimate officer who should have been prepared to provide identification and procedural information. When the voice returned, it carried a subtle edge that hadn't been present in the earlier transmissions. Peterbilt driver, failure to comply with lawful orders will result in additional charges and penalties. You are required to stop immediately for inspection. Jake's CB scanner, which monitored law enforcement frequencies throughout New Mexico and surrounding states, showed no radio traffic that would indicate patrol units conducting enforcement activities in his area. No dispatch communications, no officer check-ins, no coordination between agencies that would suggest legitimate police operations on I-40. The absence of official radio traffic confirmed Jake's suspicion that the highway patrol transmissions were fraudulent. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone was impersonating law enforcement officers to make trucks stop voluntarily, probably using the same technique that had been employed against the 7 drivers who disappeared between mile markers 127 and 128. If Jake had complied with the fake inspection order, he would have become victim number 8 in an operation that had perfected the art of making truckers disappear without a trace. Jake grabbed his cell phone and attempted to dial 911, hoping to report the impersonation and summon real law enforcement assistance. But his phone display showed no service, despite being in an area that should have provided excellent cellular coverage. His satellite communication system, which normally maintained contact with his dispatcher and emergency services regardless of location, displayed "signal unavailable" in red letters that seemed to mock his attempts to call for help. Someone was jamming his communications, cutting him off from outside contact, just as they'd probably done to the 7 drivers who'd preceded him into this technological dead zone. The equipment required for effective signal jamming wasn't available to ordinary criminals, which meant Jake was dealing with professionals who possessed sophisticated hardware and knew how to use it effectively. The fake highway patrol voice returned to his CB radio, sounding less professional and more threatening than in previous transmissions. Peterbilt driver, you will comply with inspection orders immediately. Continued resistance will result in additional enforcement action. Jake keyed his microphone and put every ounce of authority and determination he could muster into his response. This is Jake Morrison, owner-operator of Road Dog Transport, driving eastbound on I-40 at mile marker 139. I am not stopping for any inspection that cannot be verified through proper law enforcement channels. I am proceeding to the nearest truck stop and will cooperate with properly identified officers only. The response was immediate and chilling in its implications. Mr. Morrison, we know what you're carrying, we know where you're headed, and we know how much your cargo is worth. You can stop now and make this easy for everyone involved, or we can make it hard. Your choice. But either way, you're not leaving this area with that trailer. The use of his name confirmed Jake's worst fears about the scope and sophistication of the operation hunting trucks on I-40. The criminals possessed detailed information about his identity, his cargo, and his delivery schedule, intelligence that could only come from sources inside the freight industry or from systematic surveillance of commercial transportation networks. This wasn't random crime or opportunistic theft. This was targeted predation, based on inside knowledge of high-value shipments, executed by professionals who'd spent time and resources developing methods for making truckers disappear without leaving evidence that could support criminal prosecutions or civil lawsuits. Jake pushed his accelerator to the floor, overriding his truck's speed governor and forcing his Peterbilt beyond the manufacturer's recommended operating parameters. His engine roared in protest as he demanded maximum performance from equipment designed for efficiency rather than emergency operation. The trailer behind him began to sway and buck as his speed climbed past 80 mph, then 85, then 90, creating handling characteristics that threatened to exceed his control skills. But speed was his only advantage against whatever was hunting him on I-40. If he could reach populated areas, truck stops, or locations with genuine law enforcement presence, he might be able to escape the trap that had claimed 7 previous victims. In his mirrors, Jake caught sight of vehicles approaching from behind, not highway patrol cruisers with emergency lights and official markings, but pickup trucks and SUVs that moved with the coordinated precision of a military formation. The vehicles were dark-colored and unremarkable, the kind of transportation that wouldn't attract attention in normal traffic, but possessed the performance characteristics needed to pursue a truck running at maximum speed. Jake's CB crackled with transmissions between the pursuing vehicles, communications that revealed the professional nature of the operation hunting him and the extent of their preparation for intercepting high-value targets on the interstate highway system. Target is accelerating and attempting to evade contact. He made us when we tried the patrol approach. Roger that. Switch to containment formation and prepare for hard intercept. We need that trailer intact for transfer operations. Copy. Spike strips are deployed at mile marker 143. If he doesn't reduce speed before then, we'll disable his vehicle and extract him from the cab. Jake realized he was driving toward a trap that had been planned, rehearsed, and executed multiple times using the 7 drivers who'd disappeared before him. The criminals weren't just stealing cargo. They were perfecting their hunting techniques, learning from each encounter and improving their methods for capturing truckers and their loads. Every previous victim had contributed to the efficiency of an operation that was becoming more sophisticated and deadly with each successful hunt. Mile marker 140 flashed past Jake's passenger window as he pushed his truck beyond any reasonable safety margin. His engine temperature gauge showed readings in the red zone, indicating overheating that could cause catastrophic mechanical failure at any moment. His transmission was beginning to slip under the strain of sustained high-speed operation, and his trailer was oscillating in ways that suggested imminent loss of directional control. But slowing down meant capture, and capture meant joining the list of drivers who'd vanished without a trace, somewhere between mile markers 127 and 128. Jake had seen enough criminal operations during his 15 years on the highway to understand that witnesses were liabilities that professionals eliminated as matter of routine business practice. The 7 missing drivers weren't being held prisoner somewhere. They were dead, their bodies disposed of in ways that would prevent discovery and identification. Jake grabbed his CB microphone and began broadcasting on Emergency Channel 9, hoping that someone would hear his distress call and relay it to authorities who could respond with real assistance instead of fake patrol cars and fraudulent inspection orders. Mayday, Mayday. This is Jake Morrison driving a blue Peterbilt 579 eastbound on I-40 approaching mile marker 141. I am being pursued by unknown subjects attempting cargo theft and possibly kidnapping. Request immediate law enforcement assistance. Repeat, this is an emergency situation requiring immediate response. The emergency channel remained silent except for electronic interference that confirmed his transmissions were being jammed along with his cellular and satellite communications. Jake was completely isolated from outside contact, trapped in a bubble of criminal control that extended for miles along the interstate highway system. The pursuing vehicles had closed to within a quarter mile of Jake's trailer, maintaining formation while communicating through encrypted radio systems that couldn't be monitored by standard CB equipment. Jake could see at least 4 vehicles in his mirrors, probably more positioned ahead of his route to cut off escape routes and funnel him toward the spike strips that would end his flight at mile marker 143. Mile marker 142 appeared in Jake's headlights, followed immediately by the sight of something stretched across the highway ahead, a line of tire-puncturing spikes positioned to disable his truck and bring his escape attempt to a violent conclusion. The trap was perfectly positioned just before a long uphill grade that would have forced him to reduce speed, even if his tires remained intact. Jake made a desperate decision that would either save his life or kill him in the next 30 seconds. Instead of hitting the spike strip at 90 mph and losing control when his tires exploded, he yanked his steering wheel hard to the right and sent his truck careening down the steep embankment beside the interstate. His trailer whipped sideways as he left the pavement, breaking free from his tractor and beginning to roll down the hillside in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Computer servers and networking equipment worth over $2 million scattered across the desert floor like technological confetti, their cases cracking open and spilling circuit boards and cables across the rocky terrain. Jake's cab bounced and bucked as it plowed through sagebrush and jumped over rocks, his seatbelt cutting into his chest and his head slamming against the driver's side window hard enough to crack the safety glass. The steering wheel spun in his hands as his front wheels caught ruts and holes that threw his truck sideways, threatening to roll him over and crush him inside his own vehicle. But the steep downhill trajectory carried Jake away from the spike strips and the vehicles that had been pursuing him, putting distance between him and his would-be captors, while gravity provided the propulsion that his overheated engine could no longer deliver. The embankment was steep enough to prevent pursuit by the pickup trucks and SUVs that had been chasing him, creating a temporary barrier that might give him time to escape on foot if his truck couldn't be restored to running condition. When Jake's Peterbilt finally came to rest against a cluster of boulders at the bottom of the embankment, he was bloodied and shaken, but miraculously alive. His cab was dented and scraped from its collision with desert vegetation and rock formations, but the basic structure remained intact, and his engine was still running despite the abuse he'd subjected it to during his high-speed escape attempt. Jake climbed out of his truck on unsteady legs, his head ringing from the impact with his side window, and his ribs aching from the seatbelt that had probably saved his life during the wild ride down the embankment. Behind him, his trailer lay on its side like a beached whale, its cargo scattered across hundreds of yards of desert terrain where recovery would be difficult and expensive. But he was alive, which was more than could be said for the 7 drivers who'd preceded him through the hunting ground between mile markers 127 and 128. His escape had been desperate and destructive, but it had broken the pattern that had allowed criminals to operate with impunity for over 3 months. Above him on the interstate, Jake could hear vehicles moving back and forth, their engines echoing off the canyon walls as his pursuers tried to decide whether to follow him into the desert or abandon their operation before real law enforcement arrived to investigate the obvious signs of a high-speed chase and violent crash. The spike strips would have to be removed, the fake patrol transmissions would have to cease, and the entire hunting operation would need to shift to a different location or different tactics. Jake started climbing toward a cluster of lights visible in the distance, a truck stop that represented safety, communication with the outside world, and the possibility of summoning help before the criminals decided that leaving a witness alive was too dangerous to tolerate. The climb was treacherous in the darkness, with loose rocks and hidden crevices that threatened to turn an ankle or send him tumbling back down the embankment. But every step took him farther from the trap that had been set between mile markers 127 and 128. The truck stop turned out to be nearly 2 miles from the crash site, a distance that took Jake almost an hour to cover across terrain that seemed designed to punish anyone foolish enough to travel it on foot. By the time he stumbled into the bright lights of the travel plaza, his clothes were torn, his hands were bleeding from climbing over rocks, and his head was pounding from the concussion he'd probably sustained when his truck went off the highway. But he was alive, conscious and able to tell his story to the New Mexico State police officers who responded to his 911 call with the speed and professionalism that Jake had been hoping for during his desperate flight from the criminals who'd been hunting trucks on I-40. The investigation that followed Jake's escape revealed the scope and sophistication of the criminal operation that had been terrorizing commercial drivers for months without attracting sufficient law enforcement attention to shut down their activities. The mile marker murders, as the media eventually labeled the case, involved a network of criminals with access to freight databases, sophisticated communication jamming equipment, detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures, and connections throughout the trucking industry that allowed them to identify high-value targets and plan their interceptions with military-style precision. Detective Maria Santos of the New Mexico State Police had been investigating reports of missing truckers for weeks without finding enough evidence to support a major criminal investigation. Individual drivers disappearing on remote highways wasn't unusual. Medical emergencies, personal problems, and mechanical failures claimed truckers regularly across the American Southwest. But Jake Morrison's detailed account of his encounter with fake law enforcement officers, electronic jamming equipment, and coordinated pursuit vehicles provided the first concrete evidence that the disappearances were connected and criminal in nature. Mr. Morrison's survival gave us our first real break in a case that was starting to look unsolvable, Detective Santos explained during a press conference held 3 days after Jake's escape. Without his testimony and the physical evidence from the crash site, we might never have understood that we were dealing with an organized criminal enterprise rather than random accidents or isolated incidents. The crash site investigation yielded a treasure trove of evidence that had been missing from the previous 7 disappearance cases: tire tracks from multiple vehicles, electronic equipment used for radio jamming, remnants of the spike strips that had been deployed to stop Jake's truck, and, most importantly, surveillance video from traffic cameras that had recorded portions of the high-speed pursuit. The video evidence showed at least 6 vehicles involved in the operation: pickup trucks, SUVs, and a semi-trailer that had been positioned ahead of Jake's route to transport stolen cargo away from the interception site. The vehicles bore false license plates and had been modified with additional radio equipment, reinforced bumpers, and other features that suggested professional preparation for highway interdiction operations. More disturbing was the discovery that the criminals had been monitoring law enforcement radio frequencies and coordinating their activities to avoid patrol units and avoid creating situations that would attract official attention. They knew when highway patrol officers were in the area, when they were changing shifts, and when their radio traffic suggested they were responding to other incidents that would prevent them from investigating suspicious activity on I-40. The investigation team, expanded to include FBI agents specializing in interstate crime and organized cargo theft, began tracing the criminal network through financial records, communication intercepts, and forensic analysis of the equipment recovered from the crash site. What they discovered was a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple truck hijacking into systematic intelligence gathering, corruption of industry insiders, and elimination of witnesses who might threaten their operation. The breakthrough came when investigators identified the source of the inside information that had allowed the criminals to target specific high-value loads. A dispatcher named Tommy Chen at a major freight brokerage in Phoenix had been selling shipment information to criminal contacts, providing details about cargo contents, delivery schedules, and driver identities that made it possible to plan interceptions with surgical precision. Chen's arrest led to the identification of 3 other industry insiders who had been feeding information to the criminal network: a dock supervisor in Los Angeles, a terminal manager in Denver, and a maintenance supervisor in Albuquerque who had been providing intelligence about truck locations, cargo values, and driver schedules. The corruption extended throughout the Southwest freight industry, creating an intelligence network that made it nearly impossible for high-value shipments to travel without criminal knowledge of their movements. The arrest operation that followed involved coordinated raids across 4 states, targeting the criminal network at truck stops, warehouses, and private residences where stolen cargo was being processed and prepared for resale. The scope of the operation shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who thought they'd seen every variation of organized crime that American highways could produce. The criminal network had been operating for over 2 years, responsible for the theft of cargo worth more than $50 million and the disappearance of at least 12 drivers across New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. The 7 drivers who'd vanished on I-40 represented only a portion of their victims. Other hunters had been working different highways, using similar techniques to intercept trucks and eliminate witnesses who might threaten their operation. The recovery of stolen goods led investigators to warehouses in Mexico where truck trailers were being systematically stripped of their contents and the valuable cargo repackaged for sale through criminal networks that extended throughout North America. Electronics, pharmaceuticals, automotive parts, and other high-value freight were being funneled into black market distribution systems that made it nearly impossible to trace stolen goods to their ultimate destinations. But the most disturbing discovery was the evidence of what had happened to the missing drivers. In a remote area of the New Mexico desert, investigators found a mass grave containing the remains of 15 truck drivers who had been murdered to prevent them from providing testimony about the criminal operation. The victims had been executed with professional efficiency, their bodies buried in a location where they might never have been discovered if the criminal network hadn't been broken up through Jake Morrison's escape and subsequent investigation. Among the victims was Randy Coleman, a 47-year-old owner-operator from Oklahoma who had disappeared 6 months earlier while hauling computer equipment to California. His wife had filed missing person reports with multiple law enforcement agencies, but without evidence of foul play, the case had been classified as a voluntary disappearance and given minimal investigative priority. Also recovered were the remains of David Park, a 38-year-old company driver from Colorado who had vanished while hauling pharmaceuticals to Texas 3 months before Jake's encounter with the criminal network. Park's truck had been found abandoned with no signs of struggle, leading investigators to conclude that he had probably suffered a medical emergency and wandered away from his vehicle before dying of exposure in the desert. The true scope of the mile marker murders became clear only after months of investigation that traced the criminal network's activities across multiple states and revealed the systematic nature of their operations. They hadn't been randomly stealing trucks. They had been conducting a campaign of terrorism against the American trucking industry, using sophisticated intelligence gathering and military-style tactics to hunt drivers and steal cargo with impunity. The trial that followed attracted national attention to the vulnerabilities of America's freight transportation system and the ease with which organized criminals could exploit the independence and isolation that made trucking attractive to drivers but dangerous for those who transported high-value cargo. The defendants included not only the street-level criminals who had conducted the actual hijackings and murders, but also the industry insiders who had provided intelligence and the organized crime figures who had financed and directed the operation. The convictions that resulted included multiple death sentences for the killers who had murdered 15 truck drivers, life sentences for the organizers who had planned and directed the criminal enterprise, and substantial prison terms for the industry insiders who had betrayed the trust of drivers and companies who depended on their integrity to maintain the security of freight transportation. But for the families of the murdered drivers, no amount of justice could compensate for the loss of husbands, fathers, and sons who had died simply because they had chosen to make their living by hauling freight across America's highways. The trial proceedings revealed the terrifying efficiency with which the criminals had operated and the systematic way they had eliminated witnesses to protect their operation from discovery. Jake Morrison testified during the trial about his encounter with the fake law enforcement officers and the high-speed chase that had saved his life but cost him his truck and cargo. His testimony provided crucial evidence about the criminals' methods and helped prosecutors secure convictions against defendants who might otherwise have escaped serious penalties through plea bargaining or technical legal defenses. "I was lucky," Jake told the court during his testimony. "I was suspicious enough to question the fake patrol stop, and I was crazy enough to drive my truck off the highway rather than let them take me prisoner. But 15 other drivers weren't so lucky, and their families deserve to know that justice was done for the people who killed them." Jake's destroyed truck and scattered cargo became evidence in the trial, photographed and cataloged to demonstrate the violence and recklessness with which the criminals had pursued their victims. The insurance settlement for his losses provided enough money to purchase replacement equipment, but it couldn't compensate for the psychological trauma of knowing that he had narrowly escaped the fate that had claimed 15 of his fellow drivers. The investigation also revealed that Jake's escape had saved not only his own life, but potentially the lives of numerous other drivers who would have fallen victim to the criminal network if their operation had continued undetected. Intelligence gathered from the arrested conspirators indicated that they had been planning to expand their activities to other interstate highways, potentially claiming dozens of additional victims before law enforcement could identify and shut down their network. The mile marker murders case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate missing truckers and suspicious incidents on interstate highways. New protocols were established for coordinating investigations across state lines, sharing intelligence about cargo theft operations, and responding to reports of driver disappearances with the urgency that such cases deserved. The trucking industry also implemented new security measures designed to protect drivers hauling high-value cargo, including encrypted communication systems, GPS tracking that couldn't be easily jammed, and procedures for verifying the identity of law enforcement officers who requested roadside inspections. Companies began conducting more thorough background checks on employees with access to shipment information and implemented electronic safeguards to prevent unauthorized access to cargo databases. But despite these improvements, experienced drivers knew that the highway remained dangerous for those who transported valuable freight through remote areas where help was hours away and criminals could operate with minimal risk of discovery. The mile marker murders had been solved and the perpetrators punished, but the vulnerability that had made the crimes possible remained embedded in the structure of American freight transportation. Jake Morrison returned to trucking after taking several months off to recover from his injuries and testify in the trial proceedings. But he never again hauled high-value freight without security escorts and constant communication monitoring, and he avoided routes through remote areas where criminal networks might be operating undetected. His experience on I-40 had taught him that the highway could be as dangerous as any urban war zone, populated by predators who viewed truckers as prey and cargo as the spoils of war. The independence and freedom that had attracted him to trucking could also make drivers vulnerable to those who understood how to exploit the isolation and self-reliance that characterized the profession. Other drivers sought out Jake at truck stops and industry gatherings, wanting to hear firsthand about his encounter with the mile marker murderers and learn from his experience about recognizing and avoiding similar threats. His story became part of trucker folklore, shared through CB radio networks and internet forums as a cautionary tale about the predators who hunted America's highways and the vigilance required to survive in a profession that took drivers through some of the most remote and dangerous territory in the country. The stretch of I-40 between mile markers 127 and 128 became known among truckers as a place to avoid during certain conditions, particularly when traveling alone with valuable cargo. Drivers who had to use that route maintained constant radio contact with other truckers and reported any suspicious activity to law enforcement immediately, understanding that the criminal network had been dismantled but similar operations might be developing elsewhere. The New Mexico Department of Transportation installed additional emergency call boxes along the highway and increased patrol coverage during peak freight transportation hours. But these measures provided only limited protection against sophisticated criminal operations that could monitor law enforcement communications and time their activities to avoid detection. The FBI established a task force dedicated to investigating organized cargo theft operations and developed intelligence networks designed to identify criminal groups before they could claim multiple victims. But the task force operated with limited resources and jurisdictional constraints that made it difficult to pursue criminals who operated across state lines and international borders. Meanwhile, somewhere in the American Southwest, new criminal networks were probably studying the methods that had made the mile marker murders possible and developing improved techniques for hunting trucks and stealing cargo. The trial proceedings and media coverage had provided a detailed blueprint of successful criminal tactics that could be adapted and refined by other groups interested in exploiting the vulnerabilities of freight transportation. Jake Morrison understood this reality and tried to share his knowledge with other drivers who might find themselves in similar situations. He spoke at safety seminars and industry conferences, describing the warning signs that had alerted him to the trap and the split-second decisions that had saved his life during his escape from the criminal network. "The most important thing is to trust your instincts," Jake told audiences of professional drivers. "If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Don't let anyone pressure you into stopping your truck or deviating from your planned route without proper verification of their authority and legitimate reasons for the request." Jake's presentations included detailed descriptions of the fake law enforcement tactics used by the criminals, the communication jamming equipment that had isolated him from outside contact, and the coordination between multiple vehicles that had made the pursuit so dangerous. He emphasized that survival had depended not on superior driving skills or mechanical knowledge, but on recognizing the threat early enough to take evasive action. "I was just lucky enough to be suspicious and crazy enough to drive my truck off the highway rather than let them capture me," Jake explained. "But luck isn't a plan, and crazy isn't a strategy. Drivers need to be prepared for these situations before they encounter them, because there won't be time to figure out what to do when criminals are already moving against you." The audiences for Jake's presentations included not only truck drivers but also law enforcement officers, freight company executives, and security personnel responsible for protecting high-value cargo shipments. The mile marker murders had demonstrated that truck hijacking had evolved beyond simple roadside robberies into sophisticated operations that required coordinated responses from multiple agencies and industries. Some attendees questioned whether Jake's escape had been worth the destruction of his truck and cargo, arguing that cooperation with the criminals might have resulted in less property damage and potentially better outcomes for everyone involved. But Jake's response was always the same. The 15 drivers found in the desert grave had probably cooperated with their captors, and cooperation had gotten them executed rather than released. "These people weren't interested in just stealing cargo," Jake emphasized. "They were eliminating witnesses to protect their operation from discovery. Every driver who stopped for their fake patrol cars ended up dead, buried in unmarked graves where their families would never find them. I may have lost my truck and my load, but I kept my life and helped stop criminals who would have kept killing until someone finally fought back." The insurance companies that had covered Jake's truck and cargo initially questioned whether his decision to drive off the highway had been reasonable under the circumstances, arguing that he should have attempted to comply with what appeared to be legitimate law enforcement orders. But the investigation evidence and trial testimony made it clear that cooperation would have resulted in Jake's death rather than the safe resolution of a misunderstanding. The settlement negotiations that followed established important precedents for how insurance companies would handle claims related to criminal activity, particularly in cases where drivers were forced to choose between potential property damage and probable loss of life. Jake's case helped establish that drivers had not only the right, but the obligation to protect themselves when faced with threats that law enforcement couldn't address in time to prevent tragedy. The legal aftermath of the mile marker murders also included civil lawsuits filed by the families of murdered drivers against freight companies, trucking associations, and government agencies that had failed to recognize and respond to the pattern of disappearances. The lawsuits argued that better communication, coordination, and investigation might have prevented some of the deaths by alerting drivers to the danger and disrupting the criminal operation before it could claim multiple victims. Some of the lawsuits were successful, resulting in financial settlements for families who had lost primary breadwinners to criminal violence that might have been prevented through better security measures and investigative procedures. The settlements acknowledged that while individual drivers bore responsibility for their own safety, the freight transportation industry and law enforcement agencies also had obligations to protect truckers from organized criminal operations. The mile marker murders case became a landmark in trucking safety legislation, leading to new federal requirements for cargo tracking, driver communication, and incident reporting that were designed to prevent similar criminal operations from developing undetected. The legislation faced opposition from industry groups concerned about costs and regulatory burden, but the evidence from Jake Morrison's case made it clear that the price of inadequate security was measured in human lives rather than just property losses. Jake Morrison's testimony before congressional committees investigating freight transportation security helped shape the new legislation and ensure that it addressed the real-world threats that drivers faced on America's highways. His experience provided lawmakers with concrete examples of how criminals exploited weaknesses in existing systems and what measures might be effective in preventing similar attacks. Congress needed to hear from someone who had actually survived an encounter with these criminals, Jake explained after testifying before the House Transportation Committee. Theoretical discussions about security are fine, but lawmakers needed to understand what it's really like to be hunted by professional killers who have turned truck hijacking into a military-style operation. The legislative changes that resulted from Jake's testimony and the mile marker murders investigation included requirements for real-time cargo tracking that couldn't be easily jammed, encrypted communication systems for high-value shipments, and mandatory reporting of driver disappearances to federal agencies that could coordinate multi-state investigations. The new laws also established federal jurisdiction for crimes against commercial drivers and created specialized prosecution units trained to handle complex cases involving organized criminal networks. The changes represented the most significant expansion of federal involvement in trucking security since the creation of the Department of Transportation, reflecting the recognition that interstate crime required interstate law enforcement responses. But implementation of the new security measures proved difficult and expensive, particularly for smaller trucking companies that lacked the resources to purchase sophisticated equipment or hire security personnel. The industry struggled to balance the need for protection against the economic realities of freight transportation, where profit margins were often too thin to support extensive security investments. Jake Morrison found himself serving as an unofficial consultant to trucking companies trying to develop cost-effective security programs that would protect their drivers without bankrupting their operations. His practical experience with criminal tactics and survival strategies made him valuable to companies that wanted to protect their employees but couldn't afford military-grade security systems. "You don't need million-dollar equipment to stay safe on the highway," Jake told company executives during security consultations. "You need drivers who understand the threats, procedures that prevent criminals from getting inside information, and communication systems that work when you need them most. The most expensive security in the world won't help if your drivers don't know how to recognize danger or respond appropriately when they encounter it." Jake's consulting work took him throughout the Southwest and beyond, visiting trucking companies, driver training schools, and law enforcement agencies that wanted to learn from his experience with the mile marker murders. His presentations evolved to include not only his own story, but also case studies from other criminal operations that had targeted commercial drivers in different regions and using different tactics. The consulting work provided Jake with insights into the broader scope of highway crime and the various methods that criminals used to exploit the vulnerabilities of freight transportation. He learned about hijacking operations in urban areas, cargo theft rings that operated at truck stops and rest areas, and sophisticated fraud schemes that targeted drivers and companies through electronic communications. Each case study reinforced Jake's understanding that the mile marker murders had been neither unique nor isolated, but part of a broader pattern of criminal evolution that was making highway transportation increasingly dangerous for those who carried valuable cargo through remote areas. The criminals were becoming more sophisticated, better organized, and more willing to use violence to protect their operations from discovery. Jake's files grew to include reports of criminal activity from across the United States and Canada, documenting methods, locations, and outcomes that painted a disturbing picture of organized predation against the trucking industry. The information came from law enforcement sources, insurance investigators, drivers who had survived criminal encounters, and families who had lost loved ones to highway violence. The data revealed that truck hijacking had become a billion-dollar criminal industry that employed thousands of people in various capacities, from street-level thieves who conducted actual hijackings to sophisticated criminals who coordinated intelligence gathering, cargo processing, and international distribution of stolen goods. The industry operated with corporate-level efficiency and military-style discipline that made it difficult for law enforcement to penetrate and prosecute effectively. More troubling was the evidence that criminal networks were sharing information and coordinating activities across regional and international boundaries, creating a global infrastructure for truck hijacking that could adapt quickly to law enforcement countermeasures and develop new methods for exploiting emerging vulnerabilities in freight transportation systems. Jake Morrison's survival of the mile marker murders had provided law enforcement with crucial intelligence about one criminal network, but it had also revealed the existence of a much larger and more sophisticated criminal ecosystem that threatened the safety of truck drivers throughout North America. His escape had been a victory in a single battle, but the war against highway predators was far from over. The realization that his experience was part of a larger pattern of criminal activity motivated Jake to expand his safety advocacy beyond simple consulting work into active collaboration with law enforcement agencies, investigating truck hijacking operations. He became an unofficial liaison between the trucking community and investigators who needed insight into how drivers operated and how criminals might exploit their procedures and vulnerabilities. Jake's law enforcement connections provided him with access to intelligence about emerging criminal tactics and threats that allowed him to update his safety presentations and consulting recommendations with current information about how hijacking operations were evolving. The information flow worked both ways, with Jake providing investigators with details about suspicious activity reported by drivers and industry personnel, who trusted him with information they might not share with official authorities. The informal intelligence network that developed around Jake's activities became an important tool for identifying and disrupting criminal operations before they could claim multiple victims. Drivers, dispatchers, terminal personnel, and other industry workers began reporting suspicious patterns and unusual incidents to Jake, who could analyze the information and determine whether it suggested coordinated criminal activity that warranted law enforcement attention. But success in breaking up the mile marker murder network had also made Jake a target for other criminal organizations that viewed him as a threat to their operations. Several times during his consulting travels, Jake noticed vehicles following him or encountered suspicious individuals who seemed overly interested in his schedule and activities. The attention served as a constant reminder that survival of one criminal encounter didn't guarantee safety from future threats. Jake began varying his routes, travel times, and accommodations in an effort to make himself a more difficult target for criminals who might want to eliminate the witness whose testimony had helped dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. He carried personal protection equipment and maintained communication protocols that would alert law enforcement if he failed to check in according to predetermined schedules. The precautions were necessary but exhausting, adding layers of complexity and stress to activities that should have been routine business travel. Jake found himself constantly scanning for threats, analyzing the motivations of people he encountered, and questioning whether normal social interactions might be attempts to gather intelligence for criminal purposes. The paranoia was probably excessive, but it was also probably realistic given the scope of the criminal networks that had been revealed through the mile marker murders investigation. Jake had helped put dangerous people in prison for life, and those people had friends, associates, and successors who might view revenge as a necessary business expense or deterrent against future cooperation with law enforcement. 5 years after his escape from the criminals hunting trucks on I-40, Jake Morrison was still traveling America's highways, but no longer as a truck driver. His consulting work had evolved into a full-time career that took him throughout the transportation industry, helping companies, law enforcement agencies, and government organizations develop strategies for combating highway crime and protecting drivers from organized predation. The work was rewarding but sobering, as each new case study added to Jake's understanding of how extensive and sophisticated highway crime had become. The mile marker murders had been solved, but similar operations were probably developing in other regions using improved methods that incorporated lessons learned from the investigation and trial proceedings. Jake's files now contained intelligence about criminal operations throughout North America, from urban hijacking rings that targeted trucks at traffic lights to international networks that used legitimate freight companies as fronts for moving stolen goods across borders. The scope of the problem was far larger than anyone in law enforcement or the trucking industry had previously understood. The most disturbing trend was the increasing willingness of criminal organizations to use violence against drivers who resisted hijacking attempts or might serve as witnesses to criminal activity. The mile marker murders had demonstrated the efficiency with which organized criminals could eliminate witnesses, and other networks had apparently adopted similar approaches to protect their operations from discovery. Jake's presentations to driver audiences now included explicit warnings about the likelihood that cooperation with hijackers would result in death rather than release, based on evidence from multiple cases where drivers who had complied with criminal demands had been murdered to prevent them from providing testimony or descriptions that might lead to arrests. The recommendation to resist rather than cooperate represented a fundamental shift in conventional wisdom about how to survive criminal encounters. 20 years ago, we told drivers to cooperate with hijackers and hope for the best, Jake explained during a safety seminar in Dallas. But the criminals have changed their methods. They're not just stealing cargo anymore. They're eliminating witnesses as standard operating procedure. If someone tries to hijack your truck, you're probably not going home unless you fight back or escape. The advice was controversial among insurance companies and safety organizations that preferred to minimize confrontation and potential violence during criminal encounters. But the evidence from the mile marker murders and similar cases made it clear that passive cooperation was no longer a viable survival strategy when dealing with organized criminal networks that routinely murdered witnesses. Jake's law enforcement contacts confirmed that the recommendation to resist hijacking attempts was based on solid intelligence about how criminal organizations operated. The days when truck hijackers might release drivers after stealing their cargo were largely over, replaced by systematic elimination of witnesses that made cooperation tantamount to suicide. The shift in criminal tactics had profound implications for how drivers approached their personal security and how companies planned routes and scheduled deliveries. High-value cargo could no longer be transported through remote areas without armed security or technological protection that made hijacking difficult or impossible. Some trucking companies began using convoy systems for valuable shipments, with multiple trucks traveling together to provide mutual protection and reduce the likelihood of successful hijacking attempts. Others invested in armored cabs, satellite tracking systems that couldn't be jammed, and emergency communication equipment that could summon help even when standard radio and cellular systems were compromised. But the most effective protection remained driver awareness and the ability to recognize threats before they became lethal. Jake's training programs focused on teaching drivers to identify suspicious activity, assess their vulnerability in different situations, and make appropriate decisions about when to fight, when to flee, and when to comply with criminal demands. The training was based on Jake's own experience during the mile marker murders, but expanded to include case studies from other criminal operations and input from law enforcement agencies that specialized in investigating highway crime. The result was a comprehensive approach to driver security that addressed threats ranging from simple theft to organized kidnapping and murder. Jake's reputation as a highway security expert eventually led to consulting contracts with government agencies responsible for protecting critical infrastructure and sensitive cargo shipments. The work involved developing security protocols for transporting nuclear materials, military equipment, and other cargo that required protection against both criminal and terrorist threats. The government consulting work provided Jake with access to classified intelligence about threats to transportation, infrastructure, and criminal organizations that operated with sophistication, approaching that of hostile governments. The scope of the threats was far beyond what most commercial drivers would ever encounter, but the methods and technologies being developed to counter those threats had applications throughout the freight transportation industry. Jake's security clearance also allowed him to work with international law enforcement agencies investigating cross-border criminal operations that used commercial trucks to move stolen goods, drugs, weapons, and other contraband between countries. The work revealed the global nature of highway crime and the extent to which criminal organizations had infiltrated legitimate freight transportation businesses. But despite his success as a security consultant and his contributions to protecting other drivers from highway predators, Jake Morrison never forgot that his expertise had been purchased with the blood of 15 murdered truck drivers, whose only crime had been accepting loads that attracted the attention of killers who viewed human life as a business expense. The memorial service held annually at the site where the murdered drivers had been buried became an important event for Jake and other members of the trucking community who wanted to honor the memory of drivers who had died simply because they had chosen to make their living by hauling freight across America's highways. The service grew each year as more drivers, family members, and law enforcement officers attended to pay their respects to the victims and recommit themselves to preventing similar tragedies. The location became an informal shrine where truckers left flowers, personal mementos, and CB radios tuned to Channel 19 in honor of drivers who would never again join the conversations that connected America's highway community. Jake always spoke at the memorial service, sharing memories of drivers he had known and reminding attendees that the price of highway safety was constant vigilance against predators who continued to evolve their methods and develop new ways to exploit the vulnerabilities of freight transportation. We can't bring back the drivers who died between mile markers 127 and 128, Jake told the gathering at the most recent memorial service. But we can honor their memory by learning from their sacrifice and protecting other drivers from similar fates. Every driver who makes it home safely because of improved security measures or better awareness is a victory against the criminals who think truck drivers are easy targets. The memorial service also included recognition for law enforcement officers who had worked to solve the mile marker murders and prosecute the criminals responsible for the deaths. Detective Maria Santos, who had led the investigation, was honored for her persistence in pursuing a case that might have remained unsolved without the evidence provided by Jake's escape and the subsequent investigation. Other speakers included family members of murdered drivers who had found some measure of peace through the convictions of their loved ones' killers and the knowledge that their deaths had led to improved safety measures that might prevent future tragedies. The families had become advocates for highway security, working with trucking organizations and law enforcement agencies to develop programs that would protect drivers from criminal predation. The annual memorial service served as a reminder that highway crime was not an abstract policy issue, but a personal tragedy that destroyed families and communities when drivers failed to return from routine freight runs. The human cost of inadequate security measures was measured not in dollars, but in lives lost to criminals who viewed murder as an acceptable business practice. Jake Morrison's escape from the mile marker murderers had saved his own life and led to the dismantling of a criminal network that might have continued claiming victims indefinitely. But the victory was incomplete as long as other criminal organizations continued to hunt trucks and murder drivers on America's highways. The work continued, with Jake and others in the highway security community developing new strategies, sharing intelligence, and training drivers to survive in an environment where the wrong load or the wrong route could mean the difference between making it home and joining the list of drivers who had vanished without a trace on highways that remembered every tragedy and forgot no crime. The mile markers between 127 and 128 on Interstate 40 through New Mexico had been the scene of unspeakable crimes, but they had also become symbols of resistance against highway predators and determination to protect the truckers who kept America's economy moving by hauling freight across thousands of miles of dangerous highway. Jake Morrison's story continued to inspire drivers who faced their own encounters with highway criminals, proving that survival was possible for those who remained alert, trusted their instincts, and refused to become victims of predators who viewed truck drivers as prey and cargo as the spoils of war. The CB radio silence at mile marker 127 had been broken, but the memory of that silence served as a permanent reminder that some quiet on the highway was not peaceful. It was the sound of predators moving into position, and the wise driver was the one who recognized the difference before it was too late to escape the trap that had been set with mile markers as bait and 18-wheelers as the prize for those who hunted America's highways with deadly efficiency. The investigation was closed, the criminals were in prison, and new security measures were in place to protect future drivers. But somewhere on America's highways, new predators were probably studying the methods that had made the mile marker murders possible and developing improved techniques for hunting trucks and eliminating witnesses. Jake Morrison understood this reality and continued to share his knowledge with anyone who would listen, knowing that survival on America's highways required more than good equipment and safe driving. It required the wisdom to recognize predators and the courage to fight back when running became the only option for staying alive. The mile marker murders were over, but the highway remained dangerous, and Jake Morrison's story served as both a warning and an inspiration for drivers who traveled the lonely roads where predators waited with patience, planning, and complete disregard for human life. His escape had proved that survival was possible, but only for those who remained vigilant and prepared to make the hard choices that could mean the difference between life and death when the highway revealed its true nature as a hunting ground where the stakes were measured in human lives. The desert kept its secrets, and the highway remembered its dead, but the survivors carried the stories forward, sharing them at fuel stops and driver meetings where the memory of the mile marker murders served as a reminder that vigilance was the price of survival on America's highways, where predators evolved as fast as the technology designed to stop them, and where the wrong mile marker could be the last one a driver ever saw. In the end, Jake Morrison's survival came down to a series of split-second decisions made under extreme pressure by a driver who trusted his instincts more than his radio, who chose speed over compliance when authority revealed itself to be a mask worn by killers, and who understood that sometimes the only way to survive an encounter with highway predators was to be willing to risk everything, rather than become another statistic in a criminal operation that had turned truck driving into a deadly profession. His story reminded every trucker that the highway was only as safe as the driver's ability to recognize danger and respond appropriately when survival depended on making the right decision in the seconds between safety and disaster. The mile marker murders were solved, but the lessons they taught about highway predators and driver survival remained relevant for anyone who made their living behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle. Today, 10 years after Jake Morrison's escape from the criminals who hunted trucks between mile markers 127 and 128, Interstate 40 through New Mexico carries normal traffic with no obvious signs of the tragedy that once made that stretch of highway a graveyard for unwary drivers. New rest areas have been built, additional emergency call boxes installed, and patrol coverage increased to provide better protection for commercial traffic. But experienced drivers who knew the history of the mile marker murders still felt a chill when they passed through that area, particularly during the overnight hours when visibility was limited and help was far away. The highway itself looked the same as it always had: red rock formations, endless scrubland, mountains in the distance. But the knowledge of what had happened there changed how drivers perceived the landscape and assessed their vulnerability. Some truckers made it a point to fuel up before reaching mile marker 127, ensuring they had enough diesel to reach the next major truck stop without stopping in the area where 7 drivers had vanished. Others traveled in convoy formation when possible, using CB radios to maintain constant communication and provide mutual protection against potential threats. The precautions were probably unnecessary. Law enforcement had dismantled the criminal network and arrested everyone involved in the murders. But the psychological impact of the case lingered in the trucking community's collective memory, serving as a reminder that some stretches of highway carried more than just vehicle traffic. Jake Morrison's consulting business had evolved into a full-time security company that provided protection services for high-value cargo shipments throughout the Southwest and beyond. His team included former law enforcement officers, military veterans, and experienced drivers who understood both the methods used by highway criminals and the operational requirements of commercial freight transportation. The company's services ranged from simple route planning and threat assessment to full-scale security escorts for shipments that warranted special protection. Government contracts provided steady income for protecting sensitive cargo, while commercial clients sought Jake's expertise in developing security protocols that balanced protection against cost and operational efficiency. But Jake never forgot that his expertise had been purchased with the lives of 15 murdered truck drivers, whose families had trusted the freight transportation system to bring their loved ones home safely. Every security plan he developed, every driver he trained, and every criminal operation he helped disrupt was dedicated to preventing other families from experiencing the loss and uncertainty that the mile marker murders had inflicted on the trucking community. The company's training programs had become industry standards for driver security education, incorporating lessons learned from the mile marker murders and other criminal cases into comprehensive curricula that taught drivers to recognize threats, assess risks, and respond appropriately to dangerous situations. The programs were mandatory for drivers hauling high-value cargo and recommended for all commercial operators who traveled through remote areas where criminal activity was possible. Jake's personal story remained central to the training programs, not as entertainment but as education about how quickly normal situations could become life-threatening and how survival often depended on trusting instincts rather than following standard procedures. His escape from the criminals hunting trucks on I-40 demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous thing a driver could do was what seemed like the safe and reasonable choice. The training emphasized that criminal organizations had evolved beyond simple robbery into sophisticated operations that used technology, intelligence gathering, and systematic violence to achieve their objectives. Drivers could no longer assume that cooperation would ensure their safety or that criminal encounters would end with property loss rather than personal injury or death. The evolution of highway crime had made Jake's work more important but also more complex. As new threats emerged and existing criminal organizations adapted their methods to counter improved security measures. Each successful prosecution of highway criminals generated intelligence about their methods, but it also provided other criminal groups with information about what tactics had failed and what improvements might be necessary. Jake's law enforcement contacts regularly briefed him on emerging threats and criminal innovations that might affect commercial drivers. The intelligence network he had helped establish during the mile marker murders investigation continued to operate, providing early warning about suspicious activity and coordinating responses between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. But the most important element of highway security remained individual driver awareness and the ability to recognize danger before it became lethal. No amount of technology or law enforcement activity could protect drivers who failed to understand the threats they faced or who made poor decisions when confronted with criminal activity. Jake's presentations to driver audiences emphasized personal responsibility and individual preparedness, rather than reliance on external protection that might not be available when needed. The mile marker murders had demonstrated that drivers were often on their own when criminal situations developed, forced to make life or death decisions without backup or support from law enforcement agencies that might be hours away. The audience reaction to Jake's presentations varied depending on the experience level and regional background of the drivers attending. Veterans who had worked dangerous routes or encountered suspicious activity were usually receptive to security advice and eager to learn from someone who had survived a criminal encounter. Newer drivers sometimes dismissed the threats as exaggerated or unlikely to affect them personally. But the evidence from criminal cases throughout the freight transportation industry supported Jake's warnings about the sophistication and violence of modern highway crime. Truck hijacking had become a billion-dollar criminal industry that employed thousands of people and generated profits that justified significant investments in equipment, intelligence gathering, and operational security. The criminals were no longer opportunistic thieves looking for easy targets. They were professional predators who studied their prey, planned their operations carefully, and eliminated witnesses as standard business practice. Survival required understanding the enemy and preparing for encounters that most drivers hoped they would never experience. Jake's security company maintained detailed files on criminal organizations throughout North America, tracking their methods, identifying their targets, and analyzing their operational patterns for intelligence that could help protect potential victims. The files revealed disturbing trends toward increased violence and improved criminal techniques that made highway crime more dangerous for drivers and more profitable for criminal organizations. The most concerning development was the increasing cooperation between different criminal groups, creating networks that could share intelligence, coordinate operations, and provide mutual support for complex criminal enterprises. The mile marker murders had involved a relatively small organization operating in a limited geographic area, but newer criminal networks spanned multiple states and countries with resources that rivaled those of legitimate corporations. International cooperation between criminal organizations had made it possible to move stolen cargo across borders quickly and efficiently, reducing the risk of recovery and increasing the profitability of truck hijacking operations. Government agencies responsible for combating highway crime were struggling to keep pace with criminal innovations and international coordination that allowed stolen goods to disappear into global black markets within hours of being stolen. Jake's government consulting work provided him with classified intelligence about the scope of international highway crime and the methods being used to combat criminal organizations that operated across multiple jurisdictions. The information was sobering, revealing threats that extended far beyond what most commercial drivers understood or what most trucking companies were prepared to address. But the classified briefings also revealed the dedication and competence of law enforcement personnel who worked to protect commercial transportation from criminal predation. The officers and agents who investigated highway crime understood the importance of freight transportation to the American economy and the vulnerability of drivers who worked in isolation on remote highways where criminal activity was difficult to detect and prosecute. The memorial service for the mile marker murder victims continued to be held annually, drawing larger crowds each year as word spread through the trucking community about the importance of remembering drivers who had died in the line of duty. The service had become an important networking event for law enforcement officers, industry executives, and security professionals who shared common interests in protecting commercial drivers from criminal violence. Jake always spoke at the memorial service, but his message had evolved from simple remembrance of the victims to broader discussions of highway security and the ongoing threats that drivers faced throughout their careers. The service provided an opportunity to educate the trucking community about new criminal tactics and to honor the memory of drivers whose deaths had contributed to improved security measures. The families of murder victims also participated in the service, sharing memories of their loved ones and expressing gratitude for the law enforcement officers and industry professionals who continued to work for highway safety. Their presence served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of inadequate security and the importance of protecting drivers from criminal predation. But perhaps the most important aspect of the memorial service was its role in maintaining community awareness of highway crime and the need for constant vigilance against criminal organizations that viewed truck drivers as targets of opportunity. The service ensured that the lessons of the mile marker murders would not be forgotten, and that new generations of drivers would understand the threats they faced and the precautions necessary for survival. Jake Morrison's escape from the criminals' hunting trucks between mile markers 127 and 128 had saved his own life and led to the prosecution of a criminal network that might have continued claiming victims indefinitely. But his survival had also created an obligation to share his knowledge with other drivers and to work for improvements in highway security that would protect future generations of truckers from similar threats. The work was never finished because criminal organizations continued to evolve and adapt their methods to counter improved security measures. Each victory against highway predators was temporary, requiring constant effort to maintain and extend the protection provided to commercial drivers who worked in an environment where criminal activity was an ongoing threat. Jake's story had become part of trucking folklore, shared at fuel stops and driver gatherings as a reminder that survival on America's highways required more than mechanical knowledge and safe driving practices. It required understanding that some people viewed truck drivers as prey, and that sometimes the only way to survive an encounter with highway predators was to be willing to fight back rather than become another victim of criminal violence. The mile marker murders were over, but the highway remained dangerous for drivers who carried valuable cargo through remote areas where help was far away and criminal organizations could operate with minimal risk of detection. Jake Morrison's survival served as proof that escape was possible for drivers who remained alert, trusted their instincts, and refused to become victims of predators who viewed human life as a business expense. His legacy was measured not in the criminal convictions that resulted from his testimony or the security improvements that followed his escape, but in the drivers who had survived dangerous encounters because they had learned from his experience and prepared themselves for threats that most people hoped they would never face. The CB radio silence at mile marker 127 had been broken, but it had also become a symbol of the isolation and vulnerability that characterized long-haul trucking in an era when criminal organizations possessed the resources and sophistication to hunt commercial vehicles with military-style precision and complete disregard for human life. Jake Morrison's voice continued to warn drivers about the dangers they faced and the vigilance required for survival on highways where predators waited with patience, planning, and deadly efficiency. His message was simple but vital. Trust your instincts, question authority that cannot be verified, and never forget that some threats can only be survived by those who are prepared to risk everything, rather than become victims of criminal violence that views truck drivers as disposable components of profitable criminal enterprises. The mile markers between 127 and 128 on Interstate 40 through New Mexico no longer marked a hunting ground where predators waited for unwary prey. But they remained monuments to the drivers who had died there and reminders of the price paid by those who underestimated the sophistication and ruthlessness of criminal organizations that had turned highway transportation into a battlefield where survival required not just driving skills, but combat awareness and the willingness to fight for life when cooperation meant death. Jake Morrison had fought and won his battle with the mile marker murderers, but the war against highway predators continued on America's highways, where new criminals developed new methods for hunting trucks and eliminating witnesses. His story served as both warning and inspiration for drivers who understood that their survival depended on recognizing danger and responding appropriately when the highway revealed its true nature as a place where predators and prey shared the same asphalt and the stakes were measured in human lives rather than simply property damage. The investigation files were closed, but the memory remained open, carried forward by survivors who understood that eternal vigilance was the price of survival on highways where criminal organizations continued to evolve and adapt their methods for hunting the trucks that carried America's freight, and the drivers who risked their lives to keep the nation's economy moving across thousands of miles of dangerous road. In the end, Jake Morrison's escape from mile marker 127 proved that survival was possible but not guaranteed, available only to those who remained alert enough to recognize threats and courageous enough to take desperate action when conventional responses would have resulted in death. His story reminded every truck driver that the highway was as dangerous as any combat zone, populated by professional killers who had learned to hunt with tools and tactics that made them nearly invisible until it was too late for their victims to escape. The mile marker murders were solved, but the highway remembered, and somewhere between those fateful mile markers, the spirits of 15 murdered truckers served as eternal warnings to drivers who passed through the area where good men had met evil people and lost everything in encounters that lasted only minutes but changed American highway transportation forever. Their sacrifice was not in vain if it helped future drivers recognize that some threats could only be survived through vigilance, preparation, and the willingness to fight back when running became the only alternative to joining the growing list of drivers who had vanished without a trace on America's highways, where predators hunted with deadly efficiency and complete disregard for human life. The screaming started at 2:47 a.m. in the women's restroom at the Roadway Travel Plaza, mile marker 89 on Interstate 35 through Oklahoma. For Dale Hawkins, a 38-year-old veteran of America's highways who'd been hauling freight for 14 years, the sound cut through the diesel rumble and road noise like a blade through silk. He'd heard a lot of things during his career: tire blowouts that sounded like gunshots, air brake failures that shrieked like banshees, and CB radio chatter that would make a sailor blush. But he'd never heard anything quite like the raw terror that was coming from the Travel Plaza's restroom facility at nearly 3 in the morning. Dale had pulled into the Roadway Travel Plaza 20 minutes earlier, his 2018 Freightliner Cascadia badly in need of fuel after the long haul from Dallas toward Kansas City. The truck stop was one of the newer facilities on I-35, opened just 3 years ago with all the modern amenities that made overnight stays bearable for drivers who spent their lives moving freight across America's highway system. Clean showers, decent food, secure parking, and fuel islands that could handle the largest rigs. Everything a professional driver needed for a comfortable break from the road. But something about the place had felt wrong from the moment Dale pulled into the parking lot. The usual crowd of trucks was there, maybe 40 or 50 rigs scattered across the vast asphalt expanse under the harsh glare of sodium vapor lights. But the drivers were nowhere to be seen. No one walking to or from the main building, no conversations around the fuel islands, no activity at the picnic tables where truckers usually gathered to share stories and information about road conditions, weather, and the 1,000 details that made long-haul freight a community endeavor rather than a solitary ordeal. The Travel Plaza's main building was brightly lit and obviously open for business, its neon signs advertising hot food, cold drinks, and all the services that kept America's truckers moving. But the parking lot felt like a ghost town, populated by empty trucks whose drivers had simply vanished into the night. Dale had seen quiet truck stops before, places where drivers were sleeping or showering or just keeping to themselves during the overnight hours. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that made experienced drivers check their mirrors and wonder what they'd missed. Dale Hawkins wasn't a man who spooked easily. He'd been driving commercial vehicles since he was 24 years old, starting with local delivery routes in Oklahoma City before transitioning to regional freight, and eventually to the long-haul runs that took him from coast to coast, hauling everything from auto parts to electronics. He'd survived ice storms, tornadoes, mechanical failures, and the kind of highway emergencies that separated professional drivers from weekend warriors. But 14 years on the road had also taught him to trust his instincts when something felt wrong, even if he couldn't immediately identify what was triggering his unease. The Roadway Travel Plaza occupied a strategic location on Interstate 35, one of America's busiest north-south freight corridors connecting Mexico to Canada through the heart of the United States. The highway carried everything from agricultural products out of Texas to manufactured goods from the industrial Midwest, generating truck traffic that made certain travel plazas into 24-hour cities that never truly slept. Dale had stopped at hundreds of similar facilities during his career, and he knew the rhythms and patterns that characterized normal truck stop activity during different hours of the day and night. But the Roadway Travel Plaza didn't feel normal. It felt staged, like a movie set dressed to look like a functioning truck stop, but missing the human activity that would make it believable. The trucks were there, the lights were on, the fuel pumps were operational, but the drivers who should have been visible somewhere in the complex had simply vanished as if they'd been spirited away by forces that left no trace of their presence or their disappearance. Dale completed his fuel purchase without incident, interacting with a cashier who seemed nervous and distracted but otherwise normal. The young man behind the counter appeared to be in his early 20s, wearing the standard uniform shirt of a national truck stop chain and displaying the kind of practiced efficiency that came from handling hundreds of fuel transactions every shift. But his eyes kept darting toward the parking lot, and he seemed eager to complete the transaction and get Dale on his way as quickly as possible. "Busy night?" Dale asked, hoping to engage the cashier in the kind of casual conversation that might provide insight into why the truck stop felt so wrong despite appearing normal on the surface. "Not really," the cashier replied, avoiding eye contact while processing Dale's credit card payment. "Pretty quiet, actually. Most drivers are just passing through, not staying long." The explanation made sense on the surface. Some truck stops served primarily as fuel stops rather than overnight destinations, particularly during certain seasons or economic conditions that affected freight patterns. But Dale had counted at least 40 trucks in the parking lot, suggesting drivers who were taking mandatory rest breaks or overnight stops rather than simple fuel purchases. Where were all those drivers? Dale decided to use the restroom facilities before returning to his truck, partly from necessity and partly from curiosity about what was happening inside the Travel Plaza's main building. The restrooms were located down a corridor that led past a driver's lounge, shower facilities, and a small convenience store that sold the kind of supplies that truckers needed during long trips. The corridor should have been busy with drivers moving back and forth between their trucks and the various services offered by the facility. Instead, the corridor was empty except for Dale and the sound of his own footsteps echoing off tile walls that seemed to amplify every small noise into something that sounded vaguely threatening. The driver's lounge was dark and unoccupied, its television screens flickering with late-night programming that no one was watching. The shower facilities showed no signs of recent use, their doors standing open to reveal stalls that looked clean but unused. Even the convenience store seemed abandoned, its aisles empty of customers and its clerk nowhere to be seen. Dale was washing his hands at the restroom sink when the screaming started from the women's facility next door. The sound was unmistakably human, unmistakably female, and unmistakably terrified in ways that suggested immediate physical danger, rather than simple distress or medical emergency. It was the kind of scream that triggered every protective instinct that evolution had programmed into human beings over millions of years of survival in a dangerous world. Dale rushed toward the women's restroom, his mind automatically shifting into the emergency response mode that his military training had ingrained 20 years earlier. But as he approached the door, the screaming stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by the kind of silence that was somehow more disturbing than the sounds that had preceded it. The abrupt cessation suggested that whatever had been causing the woman's terror had either been resolved or had progressed beyond the point where screaming was possible. "Is everyone okay in there?" Dale called through the restroom door, hoping to elicit some response that would indicate whether his assistance was needed or whether the situation had been resolved through other means. No response came from the women's restroom, but Dale heard footsteps and voices approaching from the direction of the main lobby area. Multiple people moving with purpose and speaking in low tones that suggested coordination rather than casual conversation. The voices were male, adult, and carried an edge of authority that made Dale wonder if truck stop security personnel were responding to the same disturbance that had attracted his attention. "Sir, you need to return to your vehicle immediately." The voice came from behind Dale, spoken by a man who appeared to be in his 40s, wearing clothing that suggested management or security responsibilities. "We're dealing with a medical emergency that requires privacy for the people involved." Dale turned to face the speaker, a heavy-set man with the kind of bearing that suggested law enforcement or military background. He was accompanied by two other men who positioned themselves in ways that blocked Dale's access to both the women's restroom and the corridor leading back toward the main lobby. The positioning looked professional, like a coordinated response by people who'd practiced moving together and controlling situations that required crowd management or area denial. "I heard someone screaming," Dale said, making no move toward his truck but also not challenging the men who were obviously intent on clearing him from the area. "If there's a medical emergency, I'm trained in first aid and CPR. Maybe I can help." "We appreciate your concern, but we have qualified medical personnel responding," the apparent leader replied, his tone remaining professional but becoming more insistent. "The best way you can help is by returning to your truck and allowing our people to handle the situation without interference from well-meaning civilians." Something about the exchange felt scripted, like a conversation that had been rehearsed for situations exactly like this one. The men blocking Dale's path looked professional and competent, but they also looked like people who were accustomed to using force when persuasion failed to achieve their objectives. Dale had encountered similar situations during his military service, circumstances where civilians were cleared from areas for reasons that weren't immediately apparent but were probably related to security considerations that couldn't be explained without compromising operational effectiveness. But this was a truck stop in Oklahoma, not a military installation or crime scene that would justify the kind of area control that these men were implementing. Unless there was more to the situation than a simple medical emergency, something that required keeping witnesses away from activities that couldn't bear public scrutiny. "What kind of medical emergency?" Dale asked, testing the limits of cooperation that the men were willing to extend before resorting to more direct methods of persuasion. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to return to your vehicle," the leader replied, his tone shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed threat. "We have protocols for handling emergencies that don't include discussions with truck drivers who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." The reference to being in the wrong place at the wrong time struck Dale as an odd way to describe a truck driver using restroom facilities at a travel plaza that was specifically designed to serve commercial transportation. Unless his presence was interfering with activities that weren't supposed to be witnessed by people who might ask uncomfortable questions or provide unwanted testimony to authorities who investigated emergencies at truck stops. Dale decided that cooperation was the better part of valor. at least until he could assess the situation more completely and determine whether he was dealing with legitimate security personnel or something more sinister. He nodded to the men blocking his path and began walking back toward the main lobby, but he paid careful attention to everything he observed during the retreat from the restroom area. The corridor that had been empty when Dale entered the restroom facility was now populated with people who moved with purpose and coordination that suggested military or law enforcement training. They were positioning themselves at strategic locations that would control access to different parts of the building while maintaining visual contact with each other through hand signals and subtle positioning that spoke of practiced teamwork. But none of the people Dale observed were wearing uniforms or displaying identification that would indicate their official capacity or legal authority. They looked like private security personnel or perhaps military contractors, rather than local law enforcement officers or emergency medical technicians. Their equipment was professional grade but unmarked, and their behavior suggested they were implementing security protocols rather than responding to a medical emergency. Dale reached his truck without further incident, but instead of immediately departing the travel plaza, he positioned his rig in a location that provided observation of the main building while appearing to conduct routine pre-trip inspection activities. He wanted to understand what was happening at the roadway travel plaza before committing himself to a course of action that might put him in danger or make him complicit in activities that could be criminal in nature. The observation post Dale established allowed him to monitor the parking lot and main building while maintaining the appearance of a driver conducting normal truck stop activities. He activated his CB radio and began scanning channels for information about the travel plaza or unusual activity that other drivers might have observed in the area. Breaker 19, this is Roadrunner at the Roadway Travel Plaza, mile marker 89 on I-35 northbound. Anyone else seeing unusual activity at this location? The CB remained silent for almost a minute before a voice responded with information that made Dale's blood run cold and his hands tighten on the microphone. Roadrunner, this is Night Owl about 10 miles south of your location. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies, and there's been no medical emergency calls from that truck stop tonight. Whatever's going on there, it ain't being reported to authorities. The absence of emergency service radio traffic confirmed Dale's suspicion that the medical emergency explanation was fraudulent, designed to clear witnesses from activities that couldn't withstand official scrutiny. But if there was no legitimate medical emergency, what had caused the screaming he'd heard from the women's restroom? And why were professional security personnel controlling access to the building? Night Owl, you got any other drivers reporting problems at this location? Dale asked, hoping for additional intelligence about the situation he'd stumbled into. Negative on problems, but I gotta tell you something strange, Roadrunner. I've been monitoring CB traffic for the past 3 hours, and I ain't heard a single transmission from any driver at that travel plaza. Usually that place is busy with chatter, drivers coming and going, fuel reports, that kind of thing. Tonight it's been dead silent, like every driver who stops there just disappears off the radio. The information about missing CB radio traffic provided another piece of evidence that something systematic was happening at the Roadway Travel Plaza. Experienced drivers maintained regular communication with their colleagues, sharing information about road conditions, fuel prices, and the quality of services at different truck stops. The absence of such communication from a major travel plaza suggested that drivers were either being prevented from using their radios or were being removed from their vehicles in ways that prevented normal communication. Dale began scanning the parking lot more carefully, looking for signs of driver activity around the trucks that were positioned throughout the facility. What he observed made his stomach tighten with the realization that he might have stumbled into something far more serious than a medical emergency or security incident. Most of the trucks showed no signs of recent driver activity. No lights in the sleeper compartments where drivers would normally be resting during mandatory break periods. No activity around the cabs where drivers would be conducting pre-trip inspections or maintenance activities. no movement toward or away from the main building where drivers would normally be obtaining food, fuel, or other services. The trucks looked abandoned, positioned in the parking lot like theatrical props rather than working vehicles operated by professional drivers who maintained regular schedules and communication protocols. But if the trucks were abandoned, where were their drivers? And why would dozens of professional truck drivers simultaneously abandon their equipment at a single travel plaza without apparent cause or explanation? Dale's CB crackled with another transmission from Night Owl, whose voice now carried urgency that suggested growing concern about the situation at the Roadway Travel Plaza. "Roadrunner, I just talked to a driver who stopped at that travel plaza 2 nights ago. He said there were rumors about drivers going missing, people talking about human trafficking operations using truck stops as transfer points. You might want to consider getting the hell out of there before you become part of whatever's happening." The mention of human trafficking hit Dale like a physical blow, suddenly providing a context that explained everything he'd observed at the travel plaza. The absence of drivers, the professional security personnel, the staged appearance of normal operations concealing activities that couldn't bear scrutiny. All of it fit the pattern of a sophisticated criminal operation using legitimate business facilities as cover for systematic kidnapping and forced labor operations. Human trafficking represented one of the most lucrative and fastest-growing criminal enterprises in the world, generating billions of dollars annually for criminal organizations that had industrialized the process of enslaving human beings for forced labor, sexual exploitation, and other activities that reduced people to property that could be bought, sold, and transported like any other commodity. Truck stops provided ideal cover for trafficking operations because they were designed to handle transient populations who moved through facilities quickly without establishing relationships or creating records that could be traced by law enforcement agencies. Drivers, truck stop employees, and travelers who used such facilities expected to encounter strangers and didn't question the presence of people who didn't seem to belong or who exhibited behavior that might seem suspicious in other contexts. The screaming Dale had heard from the women's restroom suddenly took on a much more sinister significance. It hadn't been a medical emergency. It had been someone being taken against their will, possibly a victim being transferred from one location to another as part of a trafficking operation that used the travel plaza as a processing point for human cargo that was even more valuable than the freight that legitimate truckers hauled across America's highways. Dale's military training kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation and began planning his response to a criminal operation that represented an immediate threat to unknown numbers of victims who were probably being held somewhere in the Travel Plaza complex. He had stumbled into a situation that required immediate action, but he was outnumbered by professional criminals who were probably armed and certainly willing to use violence to protect their operation from discovery. His first priority was gathering intelligence about the scope of the operation and the location of any victims who might be rescued if he could summon appropriate law enforcement response. But he also needed to avoid alerting the criminals to his awareness of their activities, since premature action could result in the execution of victims and the destruction of evidence that might be crucial for prosecuting the people responsible for what appeared to be a systematic trafficking operation. Dale activated his cell phone and began photographing the travel plaza, documenting the positions of vehicles, the absence of normal driver activity, and any other details that might be useful for law enforcement agencies investigating the criminal operation. But his phone showed weak signal strength, possibly due to jamming equipment that prevented communications that could compromise the security of trafficking activities. His backup communication system was a satellite messenger device that could send emergency signals even when cellular networks were compromised or unavailable. Dale activated the device and began composing a message to law enforcement agencies, requesting immediate response to suspected human trafficking activity at the Roadway Travel Plaza on Interstate 35. But before he could complete the transmission, Dale's passenger door opened and one of the security personnel he'd encountered earlier climbed into his cab, with the casual confidence of someone who was accustomed to dealing with problems through direct action rather than negotiation or legal process. "Mr. Hawkins, we need to have a conversation about what you think you observed tonight and what you plan to do with that information." The man spoke with the kind of authority that suggested extensive experience in controlling situations and people who might threaten operational security. The use of Dale's name confirmed that the criminals had access to his registration information and probably his complete driving record, criminal background, and personal history. They had taken the time to research him while he was conducting his observation of their facility, demonstrating the kind of systematic approach that characterized professional criminal organizations rather than opportunistic criminals who responded to situations as they developed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dale replied, maintaining the appearance of cooperation while assessing his options for escape or resistance if the situation deteriorated beyond talking. "Of course you don't," the man replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're just a truck driver who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, using restroom facilities and observing things that aren't really any of your business. The question is whether you're smart enough to forget what you think you saw and continue on your route without creating complications for people who prefer to conduct their business without interference." The implied threat was clear, but it was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested Dale was being given an opportunity to walk away from the situation without consequences if he demonstrated appropriate discretion about his observations. The criminals were apparently confident enough in their operation to believe that they could allow witnesses to leave if those witnesses could be convinced that reporting their activities would be futile or dangerous. "What kind of business are you conducting that requires this level of security?" Dale asked, probing for information while maintaining the appearance of someone who was confused rather than suspicious about the activities he'd observed. "The kind of business that pays very well for people who know how to mind their own affairs, and very poorly for people who stick their noses into situations that don't concern them." The man's tone remained conversational, but his posture shifted slightly in ways that suggested he was prepared to use physical force if persuasion proved insufficient. Dale realized he was dealing with someone who had extensive experience in managing witnesses and controlling information that could compromise criminal operations. The man was giving him a chance to walk away, but that chance would probably expire quickly if Dale failed to demonstrate that he understood the seriousness of the situation and his own vulnerability to violence that could be applied with professional efficiency. "I'm just a truck driver trying to make a living hauling freight," Dale said, hoping to buy time while he assessed his options for escape or resistance. "I don't want any trouble with your business, whatever it is." "That's exactly what I wanted to hear," the man replied, his demeanor relaxing slightly while remaining alert for any indication that Dale was planning something other than cooperation. "You finish your business here, get back on the highway, and forget that you ever stopped at this travel plaza. Do that and everyone goes home happy. Try to be a hero, and people get hurt in ways that could have been avoided through simple common sense." The man climbed out of Dale's cab and walked away, but Dale noticed that other personnel maintained visual contact with his truck from strategic positions throughout the parking lot. He was being watched by people who were prepared to take action if he made any moves that suggested he was planning to report the trafficking operation to law enforcement agencies. Dale started his engine and began moving toward the Travel Plaza exit, maintaining the appearance of a cooperative driver who was following instructions and avoiding involvement in activities that didn't concern him. But instead of entering the interstate highway, he positioned his truck at a location that provided continued observation of the Travel Plaza while appearing to conduct routine maintenance activities. His satellite messenger finally achieved signal lock and transmitted an emergency message to the FBI's human trafficking hotline, providing the Travel Plaza's location and a brief description of the suspicious activities he'd observed. The message included his contact information and a request for immediate response by law enforcement agencies equipped to handle trafficking operations. But Dale knew that law enforcement response could take hours, and the criminals might move their victims or destroy evidence if they suspected that their operation had been compromised. He needed to gather additional intelligence about the scope of the trafficking operation and the location of any victims who might be rescued if he could provide law enforcement with actionable information about the criminal network. Dale activated his truck's dash camera system and began recording the travel plaza from his observation position, documenting vehicle movements, personnel activities, and any other details that might be useful for identifying the people responsible for the trafficking operation. The recordings would provide evidence that could support criminal prosecutions even if the victims were moved before law enforcement could rescue them. His CB radio crackled with transmissions between the criminals, communications that revealed the scope and sophistication of the operation he'd stumbled into. Transport 1, this is Base. We have a potential problem with the driver who was asking questions earlier. He's positioned outside the facility and appears to be conducting surveillance activities. Roger, Base. Do you want us to handle the problem permanently or just move him along? Negative on permanent solutions unless absolutely necessary. We don't need law enforcement attention from missing truck drivers. Try persuasion first. Escalate only if he forces the issue. The radio traffic confirmed that Dale was dealing with a professional criminal organization that had protocols for handling security threats and witnesses who might compromise their trafficking operation. But it also suggested that they preferred to avoid violence that might attract law enforcement attention, which meant Dale might have some leverage if he could convince them that he represented a greater threat alive than dead. Dale's observation of the travel plaza revealed systematic activities that confirmed his suspicions about human trafficking operations. Vehicles arrived and departed at regular intervals, following patterns that suggested scheduled transfers of people or cargo between different transportation systems. The vehicles were unremarkable. Vans, trucks, and passenger cars that wouldn't attract attention in normal traffic, but their coordination and timing suggested centralized planning and control. More disturbing was the evidence of systematic processing activities inside the travel plaza's main building. Dale could see lights in areas that should have been closed during overnight hours, suggesting that spaces were being used for purposes other than normal truck stop operations. The activity patterns resembled those of a distribution center where goods were received, sorted, and shipped to different destinations according to predetermined schedules and requirements. But the goods being processed at the roadway travel plaza were human beings, men, women, and possibly children who had been kidnapped or lured into trafficking networks that reduced them to property that could be bought, sold, and transported like any other commodity. The travel plaza provided perfect cover for such operations because truck stops were designed to handle transient populations who moved through facilities quickly without creating records or relationships that could be traced by people looking for missing persons. Dale's CB radio picked up additional intelligence about the trafficking operation when he monitored frequencies used by the criminals for coordination and communication. The transmissions were brief and coded, but they revealed enough information to confirm that the roadway travel plaza was part of a larger network that moved victims between different locations throughout the central United States. Pipeline Control, this is Station 7. Inbound shipment is 15 minutes out with mixed cargo, approximately 12 units for processing and transfer to northern destinations. Roger. Station 7. Processing teams are standing by for immediate turnaround. Outbound transport is scheduled for 0400 hours. The clinical terminology couldn't disguise the fact that the criminals were discussing human beings as cargo and units to be processed and transferred like manufactured goods. The inbound shipment was probably a vehicle carrying trafficking victims who would be moved through the travel plaza to different destinations where they would be forced into labor, sexual exploitation, or other activities that generated profits for the criminal network. Dale realized he was witnessing one of the largest and most sophisticated human trafficking operations ever documented in the United States. The scale and coordination suggested criminal organizations with resources and capabilities that rivaled those of legitimate corporations, operating with the kind of systematic efficiency that made their activities nearly invisible to law enforcement agencies that weren't specifically looking for evidence of trafficking operations. His satellite messenger vibrated with an incoming message from the FBI, confirming receipt of his emergency transmission and requesting additional information about the suspected trafficking activities. The response time was faster than Dale had expected, suggesting that law enforcement agencies had been monitoring the area or had received previous reports about suspicious activities at the travel plaza. Dale began transmitting detailed intelligence about his observations, including vehicle descriptions, personnel activities, and the radio communications he'd intercepted from the criminal network. The information was encrypted and transmitted through channels that couldn't be monitored by the criminals, ensuring that law enforcement would have actionable intelligence about the trafficking operation, even if Dale was captured or killed before he could provide direct testimony. But his continued presence at the observation site was attracting attention from the criminal security personnel, who were obviously concerned about the potential threat he represented to their operation. Dale could see vehicles positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated response designed to neutralize his surveillance activities through capture or elimination. Dale made a tactical decision that would either save the trafficking victims or get him killed in the next few minutes. Instead of fleeing the area and leaving the victims to their fate, he activated his truck's emergency lighting and began driving directly toward the travel plaza's main building, using his 80,000-pound rig as a battering ram to breach the facility's security perimeter and create enough chaos to disrupt the trafficking operation until law enforcement could arrive. His truck smashed through the parking lot barriers and continued toward the main building, scattering personnel and vehicles as the criminals attempted to respond to an attack they hadn't anticipated from a single truck driver who had refused to walk away from evidence of systematic human exploitation. Dale's radio crackled with panicked transmissions from the criminal network as they attempted to coordinate their response to his assault on their facility. "All units, we have a truck ramming the facility. Implement emergency protocols immediately. Move all cargo to secondary locations and prepare for law enforcement response." The emergency protocols apparently included destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses, because Dale could see personnel moving with the kind of urgency that suggested they were preparing to execute anyone who might provide testimony about the trafficking operation. But his attack had also created enough confusion to disrupt their systematic approach to evidence destruction, potentially providing law enforcement with opportunities to rescue victims and arrest criminals before they could escape. Dale brought his truck to a stop near the travel plaza's main entrance and began broadcasting on emergency frequencies, providing real-time intelligence about the trafficking operation and requesting immediate assistance from any law enforcement agencies in the area. His transmissions were monitored by multiple agencies, creating a coordinated response that would arrive within minutes rather than hours. But minutes might be too long for the trafficking victims, who were probably being prepared for execution as the criminal network implemented damage control procedures designed to protect their operation from exposure. Dale climbed down from his truck and began moving toward the building, hoping to locate and protect victims until law enforcement could take control of the situation. The interior of the travel plaza revealed the true scope of the trafficking operation that had been concealed behind the facade of a legitimate truck stop. Areas that should have contained driver amenities and services had been converted into holding areas where victims were kept in conditions that resembled military detention facilities rather than commercial hospitality accommodations. Dale found dozens of people, men, women, and children of various ages and ethnicities, confined in areas that had been designed to prevent escape while maintaining the appearance of normal travel plaza operations. The victims showed signs of systematic abuse and psychological conditioning that characterized professional trafficking operations designed to break down resistance and create compliance through terror and brutalization. But many of the victims were still alive, and Dale's assault on the facility had created enough chaos to prevent their systematic elimination by criminals who were now focused on escaping rather than destroying evidence. Law enforcement sirens were audible in the distance, growing louder as multiple agencies responded to the emergency transmissions that had revealed one of the largest trafficking operations ever discovered in the United States. Dale began moving victims toward exits and areas where they would be safe from the criminals who were attempting to implement emergency protocols that included the destruction of evidence and witnesses. But the victims were traumatized and disoriented, many unable to understand that rescue was possible, or that Dale was trying to help them rather than harm them. The first law enforcement officers arrived as Dale was attempting to organize the evacuation of victims from the areas where they had been held. The officers were FBI agents specializing in human trafficking investigations, equipped with the training and resources necessary to handle complex criminal operations that crossed state and international boundaries. "Are you Dale Hawkins?" the lead agent asked as he assessed the situation and began coordinating the response to what was obviously a major trafficking operation. "Yes, sir. I'm the one who sent the emergency transmission about this place." Dale continued working to move victims towards safety while providing the agent with a rapid briefing about his observations and the intelligence he'd gathered about the criminal network. "You did good work tonight, Mr. Hawkins. This operation has been under investigation for months, but we didn't have enough evidence to obtain warrants for a full-scale raid. Your intelligence and your actions tonight probably saved dozens of lives and broke up one of the most sophisticated trafficking networks we've ever encountered." The FBI raid that followed Dale's assault on the Travel Plaza resulted in the rescue of 43 trafficking victims and the arrest of 27 people involved in the criminal network. The investigation revealed that the roadway Travel Plaza had been serving as a central processing point for trafficking operations that extended throughout the central United States and into Mexico and Canada. The criminal network had been operating for over 3 years, processing thousands of victims who had been kidnapped, lured, or coerced into trafficking situations that reduced them to property that could be bought, sold, and transported like any other commodity. The profits generated by the operation exceeded those of many legitimate corporations, funding expansion into other criminal enterprises and corrupting law enforcement and government officials who facilitated trafficking activities in exchange for financial payments. But Dale Hawkins's refusal to walk away from evidence of human exploitation had broken the network's security and provided law enforcement with the intelligence necessary to prosecute the people responsible for systematic enslavement and abuse of vulnerable populations. His decision to risk his life rather than ignore the suffering of trafficking victims had saved dozens of people and disrupted criminal operations that might have continued indefinitely without his intervention. The investigation also revealed that Dale's experience at the roadway Travel Plaza was not unique. Similar operations were being conducted at truck stops, rest areas, and other transportation facilities throughout the United States, creating a hidden infrastructure for human trafficking that exploited the mobility and anonymity inherent in America's transportation systems. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating efforts to identify and disrupt trafficking operations at transportation facilities, but the scope of the problem was vast, and the criminals were adapting their methods to counter improved security measures. Dale Hawkins had won a significant victory against human trafficking, but the war against modern slavery continued on America's highways, where predators exploited the vulnerabilities of people who trusted in the safety and legitimacy of facilities designed to serve travelers. Dale returned to truck driving after testifying in the trials that resulted from the roadway Travel Plaza investigation, but his experience with human trafficking had changed his perspective on the highway industry and his responsibilities as someone who traveled America's transportation networks. He became an advocate for anti-trafficking efforts and worked with law enforcement agencies to train truck drivers to recognize signs of trafficking operations at the facilities they used during their careers. His story spread throughout the trucking community as an example of how individual drivers could make a difference in fighting criminal operations that exploited vulnerable populations. But it also served as a warning about the dangers that could be encountered at facilities that appeared legitimate but concealed activities that reduced human beings to property that could be bought, sold, and transported like freight. The Roadway Travel Plaza was closed permanently after the trafficking investigation, its facilities converted to a memorial for the victims who had suffered and died during the years when it served as a processing point for human cargo. But somewhere on America's highways, new facilities were probably being established by criminal networks that had learned from the mistakes that led to the discovery and prosecution of the trafficking operation. Dale Hawkins continued to monitor CB radio channels for information about suspicious activities at truck stops and travel plazas, sharing intelligence with law enforcement agencies and other drivers who were committed to fighting human trafficking wherever it appeared. His vigilance had saved 43 lives and disrupted a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years, proving that individual action could make a difference in the fight against modern slavery. But the highway remained dangerous for vulnerable populations who could be targeted by trafficking networks that operated with increasing sophistication and ruthlessness. Dale's victory at the Roadway Travel Plaza was significant but incomplete, requiring continued effort by law enforcement agencies, trucking industry professionals, and concerned citizens who understood that human trafficking represented one of the most serious criminal threats facing American society. The CB radio silence that had first alerted Dale to problems at the Travel Plaza became a symbol of the isolation and vulnerability that characterized victims of human trafficking operations. But it also represented the importance of communication and community vigilance in identifying and disrupting criminal networks that relied on secrecy and anonymity to conduct their operations without interference from people who might care enough to take action against systematic human exploitation. The investigation that followed Dale's intervention at the Roadway Travel Plaza revealed a criminal enterprise that was far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had initially understood. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force had been investigating reports of missing persons and suspicious activities at transportation facilities throughout the central United States for over 2 years. But the Roadway Travel Plaza operation provided the first concrete evidence of how trafficking networks were using legitimate businesses as cover for systematic enslavement operations. What Mr. Hawkins stumbled into was essentially a modern slavery operation disguised as a truck stop. Agent Martinez explained during a press conference held 3 days after the raid. The criminals had created a sophisticated infrastructure for processing human beings like cargo, moving them between different locations according to demand from buyers who treated people like property that could be purchased for various forms of exploitation. The scope of the trafficking network that had used the Roadway Travel Plaza as a central processing point was staggering in its reach and brutality. Financial records seized during the raid revealed transactions totaling over $50 million annually, generated through the sale of human beings to buyers throughout North America who used trafficked persons for forced labor, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, and other activities that generated profits for criminal organizations that had industrialized human suffering. The network operated with corporate-level efficiency and military-style discipline, employing hundreds of people in various capacities, ranging from street-level recruiters who identified and captured victims to sophisticated financial specialists who laundered trafficking proceeds through legitimate businesses and international banking systems. The organization maintained facilities in 12 states and had connections to similar operations in Mexico, Canada, and Central America, creating a continental infrastructure for human trafficking that moved thousands of victims annually. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the revelation that the trafficking network had infiltrated legitimate businesses throughout the transportation industry, corrupting truck stops, shipping companies, and logistics operations that provided cover for moving human cargo along the same routes used for commercial freight. The criminals had essentially created a parallel transportation system that operated within and alongside legitimate commerce, making their activities nearly invisible to law enforcement agencies that weren't specifically looking for evidence of trafficking operations. Agent Martinez's investigation team had identified at least 37 transportation facilities that were being used by trafficking networks, including truck stops, rest areas, warehouses, and distribution centers where victims were held, processed, and transferred between different criminal organizations. The facilities were strategically located along major highway corridors that connected urban areas with high demand for trafficked persons, creating a pipeline that fed victims into markets where they could be exploited for maximum profit. The criminals understood that transportation infrastructure was the key to successful trafficking operations. Agent Martinez explained during a briefing for law enforcement agencies throughout the region. They needed facilities where they could hold large numbers of people temporarily, transfer victims between different transportation systems, and conduct business without attracting attention from authorities or witnesses who might report suspicious activities. The roadway travel plaza had been specifically chosen and modified to serve the trafficking network's requirements for a central processing facility. The criminals had purchased the business through shell companies that concealed their true identities, then gradually modified the facility to include hidden areas where victims could be held, processed, and prepared for transfer to different destinations. The modifications were subtle and professional, designed to maintain the appearance of a legitimate truck stop while providing the infrastructure necessary for systematic human trafficking operations. The holding areas that Dale had discovered during his assault on the facility were hidden behind false walls and concealed entrances that wouldn't be noticed by casual observers, or even thorough inspections by authorities who weren't specifically looking for evidence of trafficking activities. The areas included dormitory-style sleeping quarters, medical facilities for treating injuries and illnesses, and processing rooms where victims were photographed, documented, and prepared for sale to buyers who specified particular characteristics or capabilities. The medical facilities revealed perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the trafficking operation's systematic approach to human exploitation. Victims were subjected to medical examinations that determined their suitability for different types of exploitation, with healthy young people being reserved for buyers who paid premium prices for victims who could perform physically demanding labor or sexual services. Older or less healthy victims were sold to buyers who required domestic servants or other workers who didn't need to meet specific physical requirements. The medical records seized during the raid documented systematic abuse that was designed to break down victims' resistance and create psychological conditions that would make escape attempts unlikely or unsuccessful. Victims were subjected to drugs that created dependency relationships with their captors, psychological conditioning that destroyed their sense of personal identity and autonomy, and physical abuse that demonstrated the consequences of resistance or non-compliance with orders. But the records also revealed that many victims had been kept alive and relatively healthy because they represented valuable property that had to be maintained in saleable condition. The criminals had invested significant resources in medical care, nutrition, and housing that would preserve the value of their human inventory while minimizing the costs associated with maintaining large numbers of people in captivity. The 43 victims rescued from the roadway travel plaza represented people from throughout North America and beyond, including American citizens who had been kidnapped or lured into trafficking situations, immigrants who had been promised legitimate employment opportunities, and foreign nationals who had been transported across international boundaries specifically for trafficking purposes. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 57 years old, with the majority being young adults who possessed characteristics that made them valuable to buyers seeking workers or sexual partners. Among the rescued victims was Maria Santos, a 23-year-old woman from El Paso who had been kidnapped 6 months earlier while walking home from her job at a local restaurant. Maria had been held at various facilities throughout Texas and Oklahoma before being transferred to the roadway travel plaza for processing and eventual sale to buyers in the Midwest who had specified requirements for domestic workers who spoke both English and Spanish. "I thought I was going to die in that place," Maria told investigators during her debriefing about the trafficking operation. "They told us that nobody was looking for us, that our families had forgotten about us, and that the only way we would ever leave was if someone bought us. They made us believe that we were property, not people. Maria's testimony provided crucial intelligence about the trafficking network's operations and methods, including details about other facilities where she had been held and the systematic techniques used to break down victims' resistance and create compliance with their captors' demands. Her information led to additional raids that rescued more victims and arrested additional members of the criminal organization. Another rescued victim was James Wright, a 41-year-old truck driver from Missouri who had been kidnapped 3 months earlier while making a delivery to a warehouse in Arkansas. James had been targeted because his driving skills made him valuable to the trafficking network, which needed experienced drivers who could transport victims and contraband without attracting attention from law enforcement agencies that monitored commercial transportation. "They didn't just want me to drive for them," James explained during his interview with FBI investigators. "They wanted me to recruit other drivers, to identify truck stops and routes that could be used for trafficking operations, and to help them understand how the legitimate trucking industry worked so they could infiltrate it more effectively." James's kidnapping revealed another dimension of the trafficking network's operations: the systematic recruitment of people with specific skills and knowledge that could be exploited to improve the efficiency and security of criminal activities. The network had identified truckers as particularly valuable targets because their mobility, independence, and knowledge of transportation infrastructure made them ideal assets for moving people and contraband across long distances without detection. The investigation also revealed that the trafficking network had been systematically targeting truck drivers who hauled high-value cargo, using the same intelligence-gathering methods that cargo theft rings employed to identify and intercept valuable shipments. But instead of stealing merchandise, the trafficking network was kidnapping drivers and forcing them to use their equipment and expertise to support criminal operations that generated far more profit than simple cargo theft. The corruption of legitimate trucking operations by trafficking networks represented a particularly insidious threat to highway safety and commercial transportation security. Drivers who had been coerced into supporting trafficking activities were forced to maintain the appearance of normal business operations while using their trucks and their knowledge of highway systems to move human cargo between different criminal facilities. Some drivers had been coerced through threats against their families, while others had been drugged or psychologically conditioned to compliance with trafficking operations. But all of them had been forced to become complicit in criminal activities that violated everything they had believed about their profession and their responsibilities as commercial drivers. The investigation team used intelligence provided by rescued victims and arrested criminals to map the trafficking network's operations throughout the central United States, identifying facilities, transportation routes, and personnel that had been involved in systematic human exploitation. The intelligence revealed a criminal infrastructure that was far more extensive than anyone had previously understood, with connections to legitimate businesses, government agencies, and law enforcement organizations that had been corrupted through financial payments or other incentives. Agent Martinez's team discovered that the trafficking network had been systematically bribing truck stop employees, highway patrol officers, customs officials, and other personnel who could facilitate trafficking operations or provide advance warning about law enforcement activities that might threaten criminal operations. The corruption extended throughout the transportation industry and into government agencies that were supposed to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. The traffickers understood that their success depended on corrupting the systems that were designed to prevent their activities. Agent Martinez explained during a congressional hearing about human trafficking and transportation infrastructure. They invested heavily in bribes, intimidation, and other methods of ensuring that people who might interfere with their operations either cooperated with them or looked the other way when trafficking activities occurred. The congressional hearing revealed that human trafficking had become one of the fastest-growing criminal enterprises in the United States, generating billions of dollars annually for criminal organizations that had learned to exploit vulnerabilities in immigration systems, labor markets, and transportation infrastructure. The profits from trafficking operations were used to fund other criminal activities, including drug distribution, weapons trafficking, and money laundering operations that threatened national security and public safety. But the hearing also demonstrated that law enforcement agencies were fighting back against trafficking networks with increasing effectiveness, using intelligence gathered from operations like the Roadway Travel Plaza raid to identify and disrupt criminal activities throughout the transportation industry. The coordinated response to trafficking operations required cooperation between federal, state, and local agencies, as well as partnerships with private sector organizations that could provide intelligence and support for anti-trafficking efforts. Dale Hawkins was invited to testify before the Congressional Committee about his experience at the Roadway Travel Plaza and his observations about the vulnerability of transportation infrastructure to exploitation by criminal organizations. His testimony provided lawmakers with first-hand knowledge about how trafficking operations used legitimate businesses as cover for criminal activities, and how individual citizens could contribute to anti-trafficking efforts through vigilance and reporting of suspicious activities. "I was just a truck driver trying to do my job and get home safely," Dale told the committee. "But when I saw evidence of people being hurt and exploited, I couldn't walk away and pretend it wasn't happening. Every driver, every truck stop employee, every person who travels America's highways has a responsibility to watch for signs of trafficking and report suspicious activities to authorities who can investigate and take action." Dale's testimony emphasized the importance of community involvement in fighting human trafficking, particularly among transportation industry professionals who were in positions to observe activities that might indicate criminal operations. Truck drivers, in particular, had opportunities to see patterns and activities that might not be visible to law enforcement agencies or other observers who didn't have regular access to transportation facilities. The trucking industry responded to the congressional hearings by implementing new training programs that taught drivers to recognize signs of human trafficking and provided procedures for reporting suspicious activities to appropriate authorities. The programs were developed in cooperation with law enforcement agencies and anti-trafficking organizations, ensuring that drivers received accurate information about trafficking operations and effective methods for reporting potential criminal activities. But the training programs also emphasized the dangers that drivers might face if they encountered trafficking operations during their travels. The Roadway Travel Plaza case had demonstrated that trafficking networks were willing to use violence against anyone who threatened their operations, and drivers who discovered evidence of trafficking activities needed to prioritize their own safety while gathering intelligence that could be useful for law enforcement investigations. Mr. Hawkins was incredibly brave, but he was also incredibly lucky. Agent Martinez explained during a training session for truck drivers in Oklahoma City. Trafficking operations are run by dangerous criminals who will kill witnesses to protect their activities. Drivers who suspect trafficking should report their observations to authorities rather than attempting to investigate or intervene on their own. The training emphasized that drivers should look for signs of trafficking activities rather than attempting to confirm their suspicions through direct investigation. Signs included truck stops or other facilities with unusual security measures, people who appeared to be held against their will, vehicles that arrived and departed according to systematic schedules without normal commercial purposes, and business operations that didn't match the legitimate services supposedly being provided. Drivers were also taught to recognize signs that other truckers might be victims of trafficking operations, including drivers who appeared to be under duress, trucks that were being operated by people who didn't seem to be the registered owners, and commercial vehicles that were being used for purposes other than legitimate freight transportation. The training emphasized that trafficking networks had begun targeting truck drivers for recruitment and exploitation, making it important for drivers to protect themselves as well as potential victims. The anti-trafficking training programs became mandatory for drivers working for major freight companies and were recommended for all commercial drivers who traveled interstate highways where trafficking operations were known to occur. The programs were updated regularly as law enforcement agencies learned more about trafficking methods, and criminal organizations adapted their operations to counter improved awareness and reporting by transportation industry professionals. But despite improved training and awareness, trafficking operations continued to evolve and adapt their methods to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies and transportation industry professionals who had been educated about signs of trafficking activities. The criminals learned from each law enforcement success, modifying their operations to address vulnerabilities that had been exploited by investigators and prosecutors. The Roadway Travel Plaza case had provided trafficking networks with valuable intelligence about law enforcement capabilities and methods, potentially making future operations more difficult to detect and disrupt. The extensive media coverage of the case had also alerted criminals to the importance of maintaining better operational security and eliminating witnesses who might threaten their activities. Agent Martinez's task force began receiving reports of increased security measures at suspected trafficking facilities, suggesting that criminal organizations were implementing new protocols designed to prevent the kind of individual intervention that had led to the discovery of the Roadway Travel Plaza operation. The measures included improved surveillance systems, enhanced background checks for employees and customers, and more systematic elimination of witnesses who might provide testimony about trafficking activities. The task force also identified evidence that trafficking networks were shifting their operations to smaller, more dispersed facilities that would be less vulnerable to large-scale law enforcement raids. Instead of using major truck stops as central processing points, the criminals were apparently moving toward a network of smaller facilities that could process fewer victims at a time, but would be more difficult for law enforcement agencies to identify and monitor. The evolution of trafficking operations in response to law enforcement pressure demonstrated the sophisticated and adaptive nature of criminal organizations that had learned to treat human trafficking as a business enterprise that required constant innovation and improvement to maintain profitability and avoid prosecution. The criminals possessed resources and capabilities that allowed them to respond quickly to law enforcement successes and develop new methods for exploiting vulnerable populations. But law enforcement agencies were also adapting their methods and improving their capabilities for fighting trafficking operations. The intelligence gathered from the Roadway Travel Plaza investigation had provided crucial insights into how trafficking networks operated and had led to the development of new investigative techniques and interagency cooperation protocols that made it more difficult for criminals to operate with impunity. The success of the Roadway Travel Plaza raid had also demonstrated the importance of community involvement in anti-trafficking efforts, particularly among transportation industry professionals who had regular access to facilities and routes that might be used by criminal organizations. Dale Hawkins' intervention had saved dozens of lives and disrupted a major criminal network, proving that individual action could make a significant difference in the fight against modern slavery. But the raid had also revealed the extent of trafficking operations throughout the transportation industry, and the challenges that law enforcement agencies faced in identifying and disrupting criminal networks that operated with increasing sophistication and ruthlessness. The fight against human trafficking required sustained effort by multiple agencies and organizations, as well as continued vigilance by citizens who understood that trafficking represented one of the most serious criminal threats facing American society. Dale Hawkins returned to his truck driving career after completing his testimony in the trials that resulted from the Roadway Travel Plaza investigation. But his experience with trafficking operations had fundamentally changed his perspective on the transportation industry and his responsibilities as someone who traveled America's highways regularly. He could no longer view truck stops and other transportation facilities as simply places to obtain fuel and services. They were potential sites where human beings might be suffering systematic exploitation and abuse. Dale began documenting suspicious activities at transportation facilities throughout his travels, maintaining detailed records of observations that might indicate trafficking operations or other criminal activities. He shared his intelligence with law enforcement agencies and other drivers who were committed to fighting trafficking wherever it appeared, creating an informal network of observers who could provide early warning about criminal activities that might otherwise go undetected. His reputation as someone who had successfully confronted a trafficking operation led to consulting opportunities with trucking companies, law enforcement agencies, and anti-trafficking organizations that wanted to benefit from his experience and expertise. Dale developed training programs that taught transportation industry professionals to recognize signs of trafficking and provided procedures for reporting suspicious activities safely and effectively. The consulting work took Dale throughout the United States and into Canada and Mexico, where he learned about the international dimensions of human trafficking and the cross-border cooperation that was necessary to combat criminal organizations that operated across multiple jurisdictions. His work revealed that trafficking was a global problem that required coordinated responses by law enforcement agencies, governments, and private organizations throughout North America and beyond. But perhaps the most important aspect of Dale's post-rescue activities was his continued advocacy for trafficking victims, and his work to ensure that people who had been rescued from criminal operations received the support and services they needed to rebuild their lives. Many trafficking victims suffered from physical and psychological trauma that required extensive treatment and rehabilitation, but government and private resources for victim services were often inadequate to meet the demand created by successful anti-trafficking operations. Dale worked with victim services organizations to develop programs specifically designed to help trafficking survivors transition back to normal life and recover from the systematic abuse they had suffered at the hands of criminal organizations. The programs addressed not only immediate needs for medical care, housing, and psychological counseling, but also long-term requirements for education, job training, and legal assistance that would help survivors become self-sufficient and avoid re-victimization by other criminal operations. The victim services work brought Dale into contact with many of the people who had been rescued from the roadway travel plaza and other trafficking operations, providing him with insights into the long-term consequences of trafficking and the challenges that survivors faced in rebuilding their lives after experiencing systematic exploitation and abuse. The stories he heard reinforced his commitment to fighting trafficking and reminded him that the stakes in anti-trafficking efforts were measured in human lives rather than simply criminal convictions or property seizures. Maria Santos, the young woman who had been rescued from the roadway travel plaza after 6 months in captivity, became one of Dale's closest collaborators in anti-trafficking advocacy and victim services work. Her experience as a trafficking survivor provided crucial insights into the methods used by criminal organizations and the most effective approaches for helping victims recover from their trauma and rebuild their lives. Dale saved my life and the lives of dozens of other people, Maria explained during a conference about trafficking in transportation infrastructure. But rescuing us was just the beginning. The real challenge is helping survivors heal from what happened to us and making sure that other people don't suffer the same exploitation and abuse that we experienced. Maria's advocacy work included testimony before congressional committees, speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences, and collaboration with victim services organizations throughout the United States. Her first-hand knowledge of trafficking operations provided lawmakers and law enforcement officials with crucial intelligence about criminal methods and the most effective strategies for combating trafficking networks. But Maria's work also emphasized the human cost of trafficking operations and the importance of providing comprehensive services for survivors who had been rescued from criminal exploitation. Her testimony helped secure increased funding for victim services programs and led to legislative changes that provided better protection and support for trafficking survivors. James Wright, the truck driver who had been kidnapped and forced to support trafficking operations, also became an advocate for anti-trafficking efforts within the transportation industry. His experience as both a victim and an unwilling participant in criminal activities provided unique insights into how trafficking networks recruited and exploited transportation industry professionals. The traffickers understood that truck drivers were valuable assets because of our mobility, our knowledge of highway systems, and our access to transportation infrastructure. James explained during a training session for commercial drivers in Kansas City. They targeted drivers who were isolated, financially vulnerable, or facing personal problems that made them susceptible to coercion or recruitment by criminal organizations. James's advocacy work focused on helping transportation companies develop security measures and employee assistance programs that would protect drivers from recruitment by criminal organizations and provide support for drivers who might be targeted by trafficking networks. His recommendations included background checks for customers and business partners, security protocols for high-risk routes and facilities, and employee education programs that taught drivers to recognize and report trafficking activities. The collaboration between Dale, Maria, James, and other survivors of the Roadway Travel Plaza operation created a powerful advocacy coalition that combined law enforcement expertise, victim services experience, and industry knowledge to develop comprehensive approaches to fighting human trafficking. Their work influenced policy development at federal, state, and local levels and led to significant improvements in anti-trafficking efforts throughout the transportation industry. But their advocacy work also revealed the ongoing challenges that law enforcement agencies and victim services organizations faced in combating trafficking operations that continued to evolve and adapt their methods to avoid detection and prosecution. The criminals possessed resources and capabilities that allowed them to respond quickly to law enforcement successes and develop new methods for exploiting vulnerable populations. 5 years after the Roadway Travel Plaza raid, Dale Hawkins was still traveling America's highways as a truck driver, but his routes and schedules were now planned in cooperation with law enforcement agencies that used his travels as opportunities to gather intelligence about suspected trafficking operations and other criminal activities. His truck was equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment that could document suspicious activities without alerting criminal organizations to law enforcement interest in their operations. Dale's covert intelligence gathering activities had contributed to several additional anti-trafficking operations, including raids that had rescued more than 200 victims and resulted in the arrest of over 100 people involved in trafficking networks throughout the central United States. His work had also led to the identification and disruption of criminal operations that were using transportation infrastructure for drug distribution, weapons trafficking, and other activities that threatened public safety and national security. But perhaps the most significant impact of Dale's continued anti-trafficking work was the network of transportation industry professionals who had been inspired by his example to become actively involved in fighting criminal operations that exploited vulnerable populations. Hundreds of truck drivers, truck stop employees, and other transportation workers had received training in recognizing and reporting trafficking activities, creating a community-wide surveillance network that made it much more difficult for criminal organizations to operate without detection. The network had been formalized through partnerships between law enforcement agencies, trucking industry organizations, and anti-trafficking advocacy groups that provided training, intelligence sharing, and coordination of reporting activities. The partnerships had created what Agent Martinez described as the most effective community-based anti-trafficking program in the United States, demonstrating the power of cooperation between law enforcement and private sector organizations in fighting sophisticated criminal enterprises. But the success of anti-trafficking efforts had also led to adaptations by criminal organizations that were making trafficking operations more difficult to detect and disrupt. The criminals had learned from each law enforcement success implementing new security measures and operational protocols that addressed vulnerabilities that had been exploited by investigators and prosecutors. The ongoing evolution of trafficking operations required constant adaptation by law enforcement agencies and community partners who were committed to fighting modern slavery wherever it appeared. The battle against human trafficking was never finished because criminal organizations possessed the resources and motivation to develop new methods for exploiting vulnerable populations and evading detection by authorities and community members who were working to protect potential victims. Dale Hawkins understood that his intervention at the Roadway Travel Plaza had been just one battle in a much larger war against criminal organizations that viewed human beings as property that could be bought, sold, and exploited for profit. His success in rescuing 43 victims and disrupting a major trafficking network had been significant, but it had also revealed the extent of trafficking operations throughout American society and the challenges that law enforcement agencies faced in protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. The work continued, with Dale and his collaborators developing new strategies, sharing intelligence, and training community members to recognize and report trafficking activities that might otherwise go undetected. Their efforts were motivated by the knowledge that every successful intervention could save lives and disrupt criminal operations that reduced human beings to commodities in markets that generated billions of dollars annually for criminal organizations. The Roadway Travel Plaza had been closed and converted to a memorial for trafficking victims, but somewhere on America's highways, new facilities were probably being established by criminal networks that had learned from the mistakes that led to the discovery and prosecution of the original trafficking operation. The highway remained dangerous for vulnerable populations who could be targeted by trafficking networks that operated with increasing sophistication and ruthlessness. But the highway also remained patrolled by people like Dale Hawkins, who understood that fighting human trafficking was not just a law enforcement responsibility, but a community obligation that required vigilance, courage, and commitment from everyone who traveled America's transportation networks. The CB radio silence that had first alerted Dale to problems at the Roadway Travel Plaza continued to serve as a reminder that some quiet on the highway was not peaceful. It was the sound of victims suffering in isolation, waiting for someone to care enough to take action against their exploiters. Dale's story had become part of trucking folklore, shared at fuel stops and driver gatherings as a reminder that survival on America's highways required more than mechanical knowledge and safe driving practices. It required understanding that some people viewed vulnerable populations as prey, and that sometimes the only way to protect victims from trafficking operations was to be willing to risk everything rather than walk away from evidence of systematic human exploitation. The fight against human trafficking continued on America's highways, where predators and protectors shared the same roads and the stakes were measured in human lives, rather than simply criminal convictions or property seizures. Dale Hawkins' intervention at the Roadway Travel Plaza had proved that individual action could make a difference in the fight against modern slavery, but it had also demonstrated that protecting vulnerable populations required sustained effort by law enforcement agencies, community organizations, and individual citizens who understood that human trafficking represented one of the most serious criminal threats facing American society. The memory of the screaming that had started at 2:47 a.m. in the women's restroom at the Roadway Travel Plaza served as a permanent reminder that human trafficking was not an abstract policy issue, but a personal tragedy that destroyed lives and communities when people failed to recognize or respond to evidence of systematic exploitation. Dale Hawkins had heard that screaming and decided to act rather than walk away, saving dozens of lives and proving that individual courage could triumph over criminal organizations that seemed too powerful and sophisticated to be defeated by ordinary citizens. His legacy continued in the work of law enforcement officers, victim services providers, and community advocates who were committed to fighting trafficking wherever it appeared. But it also lived on in the knowledge that somewhere on America's highways, Other people were listening for the sounds of victims in distress and preparing to take action against criminal organizations that viewed human beings as property rather than people deserving of dignity, freedom, and protection from those who would exploit their vulnerability for profit.